Once upon a time. Welcome to Australian Book Lovers, your destination for imagination.
A warm welcome to everyone and a huge thank you for joining us for the Australian Book Lovers podcast. Our mission is to bring fabulous Australian and Indigenous literature that spans a whole range of genres to book lovers around the globe, as well as fantastic resources and information for passionate authors looking to write their next bestseller. I'm Veronica Strachan, aka V.E. Patton, fantasy, memoir and picture book writer, reader, and your co-founder and host for today's 54th episode of Australian Book Lovers, coming to you from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country.
And I am Darren Kazenko, dystopian science fiction and horror author, avid reader, book lover, and one of your co-hosts and co-founders of the Australian Book Lovers podcast and website, coming to you today from Corner Country, where for just a moment there, Veronica, I thought the heavens were about to gush down and possibly destroy the recording. However, just as fast as it went dark, it's gone a little bit nice and blue again. But yes, episode number 54.
Yes, 54 is, I'm sure, look, for some reason it's one of my favourite numbers.
Oh, there's probably a good reason for that.
Probably there is.
Yes.
Do you have some information about the number 54?
Absolutely. So it is an absolute honour to, reach the episode number 54. So I just love it. We're getting closer to that 100 episode celebration. So thank you everybody for listening and supporting. But when it comes to number 54, did you know that it is a message that, in theory, that number 54 is a message that the ideas, thoughts and desires that we have been experiencing are an indication that it is time to prioritise our life and make the necessary changes in order to align yourself with your soul mission and life purpose, which, I like the idea. Now, apparently the number 54 also brings a message that the changes you are making to aspects of your life will bring about wonderful new opportunities for growth and expansion on all levels. Number 54 suggests that the devoted hard work you have put towards achieving your goals and aspirations, as well as positive affirmations and expectations, will manifest auspicious opportunities and rewards. With these opportunities come life changes that will bring improvements on all levels. So hopefully a little bit of that magic and mysticism behind the number 54 does represent a little bit about this episode today, because we've gone through a lot of changes and a lot of learning through the podcast journey. Yeah. Yep. And it is becoming perhaps a soul mission and life purpose.
Well, perhaps it is. I have boards and whiteboards and lots of lists and things. That's the way I manage my time. And one of the items on things I need to do today, no matter what, thank you, Brenda Burchard, for that, is number 6, goal. And it's not that goal is the last thing on my mind. It's that it's time, I think, to do a bit of reflecting for me and just reshuffle priorities and think about what is it that I want to do. I am 61. There are some retirement things coming up. There are lots of new things that I still want to do. And it's like, time to think about a goal and get yourself started. So perhaps 54 is auspicious.
Yes. And look on a nice clear night up at all the stars and the little blinking planets and the moon, whatever phase it might be in. And we really do exist in a strange universe. So might as well make reality just as strange. Anything goes. We can try anything. Hence, have this podcast.
Have this podcast. And talking about planets and stars, did you get a chance to see the 4 planets in alignment? Were you up early enough to see that?
No, I must confess that did not happen, but I would have liked to. Yeah, absolutely. But in my mind, every time I look at the stars, I get something special. So
it was pretty amazing. So Katja from the 6am Oz Riders, she put up the reminder, and so I well, I didn't make myself get up. I got up anyway the next morning, and there they were. It was just magic.
And it is magic up there, and but then it can flip on a dime too, because then I realise that half the galaxy that I'm looking at may no longer even be in existence, and then I get all existential, and then I run inside and play Xbox.
Play Xbox.
But no, episode 54.
Or Galaga. I must admit,
Galaga,
yes, it was our anniversary yesterday. We went up to Castlemaine for lunch and a little antique wander, as you know. Strack and I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the first thing that we see as we went into the vintage bazaar at Castlemaine was a Galaga machine.
Oh, lovely. Operating?
Yes, yeah, it was. Kazine said, I wonder how much it is. I must tell Darren. But it was one that was still working, and you still had to put your money in to play a game.
Oh, so it wasn't for sale.
No, it wasn't for sale.
Well, maybe that's going to be my next business adventure. I'll cruise from, there's not many fish and chip shops left, so maybe I'll go pub to pub and quietly, I'll sneak in and pretend to be a pokie machine and set it to like $5 per game. And hopefully those people addicted to pokies will become addicted to Galaga, and then everyone gets top score. I'll give their money back. Perfect, yeah. Episode 54. So I thought I'd share a few wonderful trivia moments of Australia in 1954.
Okay, give us what were we doing in 1954?
Well, in 1954, now the magazine Overland was actually established, which was an Australian literary and cultural magazine.
Which is still around.
Yeah, I believe it is, yes, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah,
now,
did you know? Because I know they're tweeting.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Did you know that, obviously established in 1954, but under the auspices, I think I said it right, of the Realist Writers Group in Melbourne, Australia, with Stephen Murray Smith as the first editor-in-chief. It was initially formed by anti-Stalinist members of the Communist Party of Australia and other members of the 1950s New Left. There's a bit of an interesting bit of trivia. Now, what's something else really cool, the Australian Academy of Science was established in 1954, and on the 1st of March, Adelaide and large parts of southern South Australia were shaken by 5.6 magnitude earthquake, resulting in the injuries of 16 people. Thankfully, it doesn't say anybody lost their lives, but a damage value of £17 million. So at the time of that article, 2017, it was equivalent of $578 million in damage. But yes, even though we're not on the plate lines or fault lines, it's Australia still gets a bit of shaking, rock and rolling. On the 3rd of February in 1954, Elizabeth II arrives in Sydney on her first visit as monarch. On the 13th of February, this is cool, Mawson Station in the Australian Antarctic Territory is established. Still one of the greatest stories ever told is the Mawson story. A couple of little songs that might have been hot on the charts in 1954. Little Things Mean a Lot by Kitty Callan, and I chose these titles because I think they might have something to do with our guest later. And Young at Heart for Frank Sinatra, and Secret Love by Doris Day. However, the two
I could sing a few bars of that for you if you like. Yeah, anyways, move on.
The most important event that happened in 1954, this is a very special moment in time. I think it did shape Australia in very profound and unique ways, and probably will echo throughout eternity. So in 1954, Bob Hawke was immortalised by the Guinness Book of Records for sculling 2.5 pints of beer in 11 seconds.
Only in Australia. Seriously?
So that completely marries in with that very importance of the number 54. See, his sole purpose was to break records and then represent the country, and what a journey that was. So good character, Mr. Hawke. So there we go. Just a couple of things about 1954 living in Australia. So to celebrate episode 54.
Very good.
Well, shall we jump into some news for episode 54?
That'd be great.
Yay!
All right, so a little bit of news for you from the publishing area. First of all, the Australian Society of Authors. Don't forget to jump onto the National Author Survey, as we mentioned in the last episode. Macquarie University, Council for the Arts, Copyright Agency, all encouraging members to jump in and complete their National Author Survey. a little article in the ASA also about the 2022 federal election, which is taking place soon. For those of you who are not in Australia, just kind of avoid Australian media pretty much up till the 21st, actually for a few days after. Anyway, the Australian Society of Authors is advocating for all parties across the political spectrum to develop policy commitments that better support the careers of writers and illustrators. And their policy includes a call for the national funding framework for books and reading, greater investment in writers, and the literary ecosystem in its entirety. So support for First Nations writing and publishing, digital lending, and more. So you can read their statement there if you wanted to have a little bit of a look at that. And also, and this is something perhaps for readers and organisers of festivals and things to have a think about, the Copyright Agency Cultural Fund has confirmed that all writers' festivals receiving funding from the Cultural Fund have to pay minimum ASA rates for sessions that the fund is supporting. So often you'll get festivals asking authors and artists to appear, saying that it'll help their exposure.
Their exposure, yes.
Their exposure.
Can I come and get a free meal and I'll take a photo for Instagram?
Exactly. Remembering that, as we mentioned last week, it's only about, the average is $12,900 for, writers. That's their average yearly income. So writers cannot rely on just sales of their book. They don't get the whole price that you pay. There's publishers, there's printers, there's agents. Everybody gets a little bite of that. And so many writers have to do school visits. They do workshops. They don't have to, but they do. School visits and workshops. They teach and they appear at festivals and those kind of things, contributing to the community. But, please don't ask them to come for free unless it's something that they're desperate to support, or it's maybe it's a fundraiser for a particular thing and you could, negotiate that with them. But there are minimum rates, and you can look at those on the Australian Society of Authors guidelines. Appearing at literary festivals, minimum practice guidelines. So, if you want to pay them more, go for your life.
But I like the idea of that because, for a lot of us, myself included, it can be sometimes difficult to have that conversation about payment for services rendered.
Yeah.
And that way it's kind of, it takes it out of your hands to a certain degree and say, well, look,
Yes.
the minimum rate would be this, and I'm happy to do that. Or, look, this is what I'm going to be charging based on the minimum rate, but this is a little bit more, whatever it might be, and requires a little bit more work. But at least you've got that starting point, and that's non-negotiable. So that makes it less awkward for people that find it awkward to have those conversations. And, it also allows communication to start from a good point.
Yeah. And money is just an energy, I guess, if you want to look at it in that way, in terms of, I give something, somebody gives me money in return. In the older days, you might have given me a bag of potatoes, but these days you have to give me, dollars.
I don't know. I'd take a good bag of potatoes today for services.
Well, I'm going to dig some more up for you.
Money's cheaper, I think. The food's getting expensive. So, yes, for my services rendered, happy to take onions, potatoes. I like capsicums.
Yeah, anything hot and spicy.
Mushrooms.
This is the thing. Mind you, I prefer something baked. So, if, Darren's cooking is more focused on the savoury and the spices, mine's more focused on, how many calories and sugar and, the rising agents I can get into the muffins. But anyway, there you go.
So for a copy of my latest book, simply send 6 potatoes, 2 capsicums to P.O. Box.
Wouldn't that be funny if we went back to that way? Oh, and look, in lots of the dystopian books I read, it kind of happens because, of course, the monetary system shuts down completely and we go back to bartering.
Absolutely.
All right,
I could
so
see
that's enough
myself
of
in
that.
a dystopian future telling stories around fire in return for a bowl of soup as the nuclear winter flakes fall down.
Yeah, well, it's get to be soup weather over here. It's only 10 degrees. I can't get away with a whole episode and not mention the weather in Melbourne. So, yes, it is only 10 degrees here. We've got the fire going.
Can't believe you've still got summer. Oh, that's a bad Adelaide joke.
Hilarious. All right, on now to the Australian National University School of Literature, Languages and Linguistics. So our letter for the day for meanings and origins of Australian words and idioms, and we might take a couple of weeks to do this, is T.
And of
So-
course, going backwards.
Yeah, I am going backwards. Just why not?
Yeah, I think the best way to do it.
Because when you have my maiden name was P, as you know, V Patton, and now my name is Strachan with an S. I'm always at the end of the alphabet, so we always were the last to be picked or called or those kind of things. So I often like to start the other way so that we come earlier. Anyway, there you go.
Reminds me of, I think I've mentioned it before, my friend back in primary school who his name was Aaron with double
Yeah.
A. And
Yeah.
he said his parents were fighting just after he was born, so they just grabbed the book and took the first name, which was Aaron double A.
Literally the first one.
Whether that's true or not, I don't know.
There you go. All right.
So the letter T.
The letter T, tall poppy.
Ah, yes.
Heard of that one?
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is a particularly Australian thing.
I think it's
So
still a
a
strong
person-
fixture in our vocabulary.
Yeah, very much. A person who is conspicuously successful, especially one who attracts envious notice or hostility. It's often said that Australians have a tendency to cut tall poppies down to size by denigrating them, and we are pretty good at the slagging, let's be honest. It may have its origin in an obsolete 17th century sense of the word poppy, meaning a conspicuous or prominent person or thing, frequently with implications of likely humiliation. So this meaning of poppy is likely to refer to the Roman historian, now I'm going to say Livy's, could be Livy's, account of Tarquinius Superbus, who silently showed how to deal with potential enemies by striking off the heads of the tallest poppies in his garden with a stick. Yeah.
That's interesting because, look, no way am I sorry, in any way historically accurate on any given day, let alone the best of days. But tall poppy, I kind of always feel like it's not so much attacking, from an Australian perspective, not so much attacking someone's success, but I feel like it kind of represents when there's that feeling that that success was only obtained due to some sort of special accessibility or even old money. And then if I follow my conspiracy hat, the old money would come from an English background. Now, and of course, what did the English make a lot of money from? Heroin trade, opium. Well, that's the truth, isn't it? So the tall poppy, the heroin. So the people that have made a good living off the heroin money and have come and established over here, and they've got that old money that can open up so many opportunities that many of us can't. That's what I think of as tall poppy, is just watching the heroin dealers now try and tell us what good people they are. But anyway, that's my conspiracy thought for the day.
Who don't have conspiracy theory under every leaf. It's probably not quite the way I would consider it. For me, it's more that, I don't know, maybe it just comes from, my own thinking. Well, it does come from my own thinking. If you are successful, then you're kind of putting yourself above people because you're saying you can do it better. And so we like to squish you back down with the masses and don't be trying to get ahead of yourself. And I wonder how much of that comes from the large convict populations that we had, when the European settlement in Australia first happened, and whether that was a little bit, I guess, your sense of the
leveling the playing
English
field.
masters, yes, being the ones, and you'd like to cut them down. But anyway, regardless of it, it is still about.
It is,
But
and
in
it is-
18, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, and isn't it funny? I think if you pulled off 20 people off the street, everyone would have a different interpretation, and yet everybody knows it so intimately as a term.
Yeah.
Yes, cool, interesting.
The particular article says that in 1894, and I reckon that's 1994, the Oakley leader in Melbourne, because I don't think Oakley would have been around in 1894, said he could avert direct taxation on wealth by retrenching all the low-paid civil servants while carefully protecting the tall poppies who have very little to do. So, that's kind of fits in a little bit with both of what we're thinking.
I could
But there's
picture
tall
that being
poppy.
to be said more in 1894, funnily enough. That sounds kind of like something that would be said back then.
Yeah, maybe it was 1894. Anyway, there
Yes.
you go.
As you can see, I'm not a historian.
All right, but if I said to you, things are crook in Tallarook, would you know what I was talking about?
No, I'd assume maybe you're hinting you got food poisoning and you might have to leave the party early, but otherwise, no, I can't say I've heard that before.
Oh, there you go. That is something, that kind of rhyming slang. I'm sure you've had other bits and pieces of rhyming slang. But basically, a rhyming catchphrase used to indicate that things are bad or unpleasant. So things are crook in Tallarook just means things are pretty bad. Mind you, I've been to Tallarook and it's not bad. It's a delightful little small town in northern Victoria. But Australians are also very good at this rhyming slang, such as things are dead at Birkenhead, there's no work at Burke, no Luca at Yucca, everything's wrong at Wollongong. There's just a few of them. And they are sometimes thought to be associated with the Great Depression of the 1930s, when massive unemployment meant that many people travelled long distances looking for work. But Things Are Crook in Tallarook isn't recorded until the early 1940s. So you can see 1988. Here's another one. In a book, You'll Die Laughing, how stiff can you get? No tube, no jack, no spare, no car, no bike, no phone, no hearse, and no bloody undertaker. Things are crook in Tallarook. There you go. So, do you know any rhyming slang?
Well, I was just thinking then, if for any international listeners, if someone asks you to pass the dead horse, do not reach for any recently deceased animal. reach for the ketchup, which obviously we call tomato sauce. Dead horse. Yeah. I guess surfing stuff, let's go have a Captain Cook. So I look. Yeah.
See you later, alligator. Even things like that, we just like that kind of, the rhymes, I guess, in a wild crocodile. All those kind of bits and pieces. So there you go. Things are crook in Tallarook just means things are bad or unpleasant, and no denigration of the lovely little northern Victorian town of Tallarook. Anybody from Tallarook, feel free to ring up and tell me how fabulous it is.
Yes.
I'm just going to give you one more, because I think, given the COVID lockdowns that many of us around Australia have experienced, that they'll be pretty familiar with trachydacks.
Yes.
So they are, in fact, of course, the trousers of a tracksuit, trackie being the colloquial term for tracksuit. And look, chiefly used in Australia and Britain and recorded from the 1980s, the word Dax began as a proprietary name and trademarked in the 1930s for a brand of trousers. So in Australia, Dax became used as a generic term for trousers from the 1960s. And the two words appear, of course, in the compound trachydax. 1993 was the first recorded use. And whether you love them or deride them as daggy, they are Australia's favourite leisure wear.
Well, I think there's been quite an evolution of the old trachydax, because I know,
Yes.
it sort of going back a little bit, it was a case of, there was always that laugh of once you're going to the shops in your trachydax, you're basically telling the world you've given up or don't care anymore.
Although I did hear one of our authors, I think it was Mary Lou Stevens, who's appeared on our podcast, mentioned that she felt she'd crossed the Rubicon because she went to pick up her takeaway in her pajama pants.
Well, that's next level. That's not telling the world you give up. That's telling the world that you are comfortable and you are rocking this crazy universe.
Yeah.
But it's funny, and if I think of like tracksuits in Europe, I think of like gangsters and stuff with their, that get around and all they do is get around in shiny tracksuits and bling and that, which is not something I would say a lot. It's kind of the opposite here. Like you said, we've always thought it was daggy. However, with the COVID situation, trackies has really become a much loved, and I think well-deservedly loved work uniform. And we don't want to let it go now.
Work uniform.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to admit that I've got a pair of trachydax on at the moment.
There we go, yeah. And I think now that employers want people to go back to the city, especially in winter, which is not the right time to try and do it, when you can perform the same job at home in your trachydax, then, it just goes to show that people are pushing back. Why? Because they've discovered that life in trachydax is actually much better. And it's not a sign of giving up. It's a sign of happiness. That's what I think. So it could be the new wave. The trachydax could be like a symbol of this new wave, this new frontier that we're slowly edging towards, where there's a shift in employment expectations and employee expectations about, or you're working from home versus having to commute, pay all those parking and tolls and petrol and all that, or get into your favourite trachydax, do a better job than you would because if you get to by the time you get to work all stressed, and perhaps that should be maybe we can add that to the national flag. I wonder how we could put some tracky pants. Yes, or maybe we could have tracky pants day where we all somehow pitch a pair of tracky pants on our roof to let them fly high and wave to the heavens all across the suburbs. So
now,
let's get it
it's
happening.
interesting that these words are coming into our lexicon, because I'm currently reading Neuromancer by William Gibson, and it's a 1984 science fiction novel and he's an American-Canadian writer, but he's considered one of the earliest and best-known works in the cyberpunk genre. And in fact, he was credited with inventing the word cyberspace. And I thought, wow, you just don't know when a word that you've made up suddenly becomes a word that now everybody uses. Most of the Western world, or anyone who's got the internet, would not really blink if you said cyberspace to them. But there were days, not, only 40 years ago, when that was pretty new.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean,
so
words shift too. If you say influencer now, talking about setting minimum pay, for most of us, that instantly represents somebody on an Instagram platform.
Yeah.
So it's kind of been, words can be hijacked as well. For good,
this is true.
Good or bad. But,
and it is just fascinating to read Neuromancer, because it just keeps reminding me of things like The Matrix. So I'm not sure whether they were the books of The Matrix or whether they were drawn from, reading the Neuromancer and the rest in the series. But it's just, it is an amazing dystopian book. Really good story.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. All right, so that's probably enough meanings and origins of Aussie words. We've done what happened in 1954. Have you got some new books for us?
I have got a very cool book I'd like to tell our listeners about that's just popped onto the website. And then I thought for this episode I wanted to chat about a couple of really cool competitions that everyone can get involved in. But as far as book is concerned, we've got a new listing called There'd Better Be Oxy in That Christmas Bonbon, a memoir by Terry Campbell. And that is, it's obviously biography and memoir, a hint given in the title there. But yes, a pretty damn cool title, I must say, and instantly evokes the comedic attitude that listeners and readers will probably have a whole bunch of fun with. So it reads as, I was a scared, skinny, desperate kid. My skin felt like ants were crawling on it, and my teeth hurt from being clenched together. My stomach was always doing cartwheels. I felt sick all day, every day. I couldn't concentrate on much because I expect things to go horribly wrong, and I was right to think they would because they always did. I felt it all, every flawed thought, every mischievous act, every consequence my parents dodged, and I carried. While other kids grew up in a garden of love, I wilted in a weeded field from humiliation. Lessons are easy to learn in catastrophe and chaos. To become a decent person, all I needed to do was the complete opposite of everything they did. And somewhat secretive in that description. It makes you really want to find out what's happening there. But that is called There'd Better Be Oxy in That Christmas Bonbon, a memoir by Terry Campbell, once again to be found under our biography and memoirs genre page with our super groovy wombat.
Wouldn't be your favourite, would he?
Nah, this week he is. Next week probably will be. In fact, let's just make him an all-time favourite. We may have some more. We will have some more genres as we expand more. So we definitely have some more animals. So you never know. Currently number 1 on the animal hit chart, but we'll see what happens. And racing up the charts this week now.
Yeah.
And so I'd like to now spotlight a couple of short story competitions, or at least, should I say, one short story competition and one poetry competition. But the Western Australian and Minderoo Foundation are presenting the Best Australian Yarn, which is a search for Australia's best short story. The competition is asking for fiction submissions that are between 1,500 and 2,500 words. The competition is open to all Australian published and unpublished writers, students, basically anyone over the age of 12. As far as the overall winner, there is a $30,000 prize waiting for the overall winner. If you are in Western Australia, there is also a Western Australia winner prize of $4,000. There is a regional Australia prize for a regional Australia winner of $3,000. There is also a youth winner prize of $2,000, which includes mentoring. There is a Reader's Choice prize of $2,000, and there is also 9 shortlisted for the overall prizes of $1,000 each. It is absolutely free to enter. Now, the closing date is the 31st of May, so the end of this month. So by the time this podcast gets out, that it should give you close to 3 weeks to quickly whip something up if you haven't whipped up something, or whip out some of your short stories and start getting them polished and get them in there. So remember, it's for fiction and between 1,500 and 2,500 words. So for more information, it's pretty easy. Just visit bestaustralianyarn.com.au and you'll find all the information with regards to that contest. So the other contest I'd like to tell you about is the 2022 Udguru Nunakul Prize, which is now open. This one is a poetry prize, and it's actually it's set in Queensland, but it's a national prize. So let's have a look here. So the Udguru Nunakul Indigenous Poetry Prize is Australia's only open age prize for an unpublished poem by an Indigenous writer. This prize is named in honour of Udguru Nunakul, the first Aboriginal Australian to publish a book of verse, with permission from the Walker family and in close consultation with the Quandamooka Festival. Udguru Nunakul Indigenous Poetry Prize is free to enter and is open to all Indigenous poets emerging and established throughout Australia, with a $2,000 first prize published in Overland. Oh, there we go. We're just talking about Overlands. Funny how these things work.
Circles and circles.
Yes, absolutely. So to learn more, I would just go to qldpoetry.org, so queenslandpoetry.org, and look up the 2022 Udguru Nunakul Prize, which is now open. Oh, and as far as the entries close on 5th of June, so still plenty of time to get those poetry submissions. The last little contest I'd like to let our readers know about is the Big Issues 18th Annual Fiction Edition. Woo-hoo. So apparently, yes, they are having 2 fiction editions in this one year. Oh. So be part of the biggest selling fiction magazine in Australia. Previous editions have featured stories from Jane Harper, Tony Birch, Matthew Riley, Melanie Shang, Christos Tsiolkas, Alice Pung, Graham Simpson, Maxine, Benebe Clark, whole bunch of stuff. So the Big Picture are looking for stories of all kinds: literary, comedy, romance, sci-fi, crime, and everything in between. Submission details. Entry is free and every author published is paid $500. Stories should be between 500 and 3,000 words. Stories must previously be unpublished, and submissions are limited to 1 story per person. Basically, let's have a look. Entries close at 11:59 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on Monday, the 13th of June, 2022. So there's plenty of time to get a really cool story put together and possibly get published and get $500. And just visit thebigissue.org.au, and it will have all the information you want to know about the annual fiction edition competition. So the Big Picture, yes, there you go. It's a magazine, cool. Big Issue, sorry.
The Big Issue,
magazine that
it's a great mag, and I love getting that edition.
Well, there we go. The big fiction edition. So get yourself a quick $500, get famous, and get those stories in there. But that is my news for episode 54. A couple of cool contests that I think any authors out there should jump on, and a wonderful little new book edition about a little bit of Oxy and a bonbon. So what a beautiful combination.
All right. So tell me now about our author interview for the week, because this is going to be a good one.
Yes, I am super special to have had the opportunity to chat with author Tanya Heaslip, and covered so much ground, and I just learnt so much, and was I guess there was so much inspiration that came through just about everything she talked about, and there's just such a great passion and love of life that I just couldn't help but bask in the glow of, thanks to the wonderful conversation that I was able to have with Tanya. And I think for our listeners, you're just going to have I'm sure you're going to find exactly the same. It's just an inspirational chat and just so many beautiful anecdotes and historic information and reflections on what is and continues to be such a fascinating life in Australia. So I can't put into words what anywhere near as good as Tanya. So how about we just jump to the interview and let our readers enjoy such a wonderful opportunity.
Excellent. Let's go.
To all of our amazing listeners, I am so happy today and so privileged to introduce our next guest. Now, a spectacular Australian author raised on a cattle station in the Northern Territory, a well-respected lawyer and a much-loved and important treasure of the Alice Springs community, Tanya Heaslip, welcome to the Australian Book Lovers Podcast.
Oh, thank you, Darren. It is so much fun to be here.
Yeah, and it's so much fun to have you. And look, I suspect there is just so much to talk about because, wow, you've got a lot of adventures and some fantastic books released. So I sat there and thought, where on earth are we going to begin? So I thought, now, in your biography, obviously, you make clear that you were raised on a cattle station north of Alice Springs in the 60s and 70s, which would have been a pretty groovy time to be out there. And it also mentioned that you, because of that growing up in that environment, you learned a lot about the outside world through School of Air. And so I thought, before we jump into all of the adventures and all the fun and all the life-changing moments that you've had since that life on the cattle station, but I was basically wondering how it feels and what's your observations to be a part of today's global communication lifestyle after having grown up with, what anyone would consider probably limited methods of connecting. So do you think that from your experience, having sort of traversed all the spectrums, do you think as a society that we've gained some sort of profound ground with regards to communication? Or is it a case of just new methods delivering traditional information? Because I think, you've probably seen a bigger curve, should I say, than most of us.
That is a very interesting question to start with. It's an interesting question altogether because I think there's a lot of debate at the moment as to whether access to social media and the kinds of ready communication we have helps or in some ways hinders real communication between real people. Certainly, well, now, having lived in many places and having returned to Alice, it is a whole different world. And I do feel immediately connected to anywhere in the world from being here because I can pick up the telephone, mobile, Zoom, Facebook, however I want to connect with someone, FaceTime, I can do it. So there's no sense of being isolated, even though in old terms it's 1,000 miles in every direction from Alice before you hit anywhere. So 1,600 k's to Adelaide, 1,600 k's to Darwin, further to the east and west. When I grew up, of course, like all children, you don't know any different. So
true, yeah.
I also didn't know I was isolated back then because I just lived in this very happy bubble of being a bush child, living a bush life, not knowing really that there were other lives out there. And when I got older and understood there were other lives out there, they were something else. They weren't part of my reality, and my reality was so rich and full. And there was no sense that I was in any way deprived. But the communication was very, very different. And I think, when you live in the bush, even today, but certainly back in the 60s and 70s, the only communication you had was through the two-way radio, which went through the Royal Flying Doctor Service channels, and you had limited access to that at specific times each day, and you could call in for emergencies, medical emergencies on the Royal Flying Doctor Service. Then they would have telegrams where people would send and receive messages, I suppose the equivalent today of texting really, but much slower and more expensive. And then in certain times in the afternoon or very early morning, you could call people on other cattle stations, and the idea was you had about 5 to 10 minutes max because everyone else wanted to get on and you're all talking over the top of one another otherwise. And of course everyone can listen in. So there was this sense of if you communicated, there was only one channel to do it through, and that was on the radio, and that everybody could listen in to your business. So that's how people also kept connected. And human beings are very social animals, and even out here in the bush, people wanted to connect to other people on other stations to know what was happening. And apart from that, learning about the outside world for me was through books, and that's why books became such a huge part of my life. And the Royal Flying Doctor Service also delivered up School of the Air for half an hour each day. So for half an hour each day, I had my own special communication with a teacher I couldn't see and other students I couldn't see, only about 5 of us. But that for me was my outside world connection, because of course kids weren't allowed on the radio at any other times. That was for the grown-ups. So it was different, but it still felt incredibly rich. But we knew we lived a long way from anywhere else, whereas now, as I said, it's with the communication we have, there's no sense being isolated unless you physically want to go somewhere, and then it's difficult and expensive, and you have to work out, do you drive or do you fly, or whatever it might be. Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I do think overall we've benefited by having the kind of access we do to everyone everywhere. But there was something very precious about the way I grew up and that freedom.
Sometimes I feel like it is a case of the more things change, the more things stay the same. So, for example, you mentioned, effectively a two-way radio. You had a bit of a party line happening, which is kind of like the beginning of a Facebook or a Twitter or anything. And because, like you said, everybody could listen in. So it's quite similar in the sense of you're putting aspects of your life out there for everyone to be able to have access to. I'm just curious, did you have a handle when you weren't doing the school stuff and just doing the communicating? Did you have a nickname that was specifically yours?
Yeah. Well, it was for School of the Air as well. So every station had what we called a call sign. So as was Sierra Victor Uniform, the base, which was the Royal Flying Doctor Service base, and from which also School of the Air was entwined, was VJD. And all of the stations around us had their own call signs. And so interestingly, and this was kind of a fun fact that didn't seem strange at the time, but I look back now and think, wow, we all knew each other more through our call signs than our names.
Ah, there you go.
Yeah, so for example, for the last 2 years of my School of the Air, which were grade 6 and grade 7, there were only 2 of us in the class. Another girl called Lee, who lived 500 miles from me to the northeast, and we only saw each other once a year, very briefly, at what they called a School of the Air get together. But my call sign was Sierra Victor Uniform, and hers was Echo Bravo Papa. So whenever we see each other now as adults, or we talk to each other, it's Sierra Victor Uniform to Bravo Echo Papa.
That's beautiful.
All bush kids, no matter what age they are now, all still greet each other like that. We think of each other in terms of our call signs because that was our form of communication. So we've only just sort of realised now as we've got older that that's the case, and that does seem like a fun fact.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But it must be also a little touch ironic that, with COVID and some of the schooling having to be going back to home, that a lot of kids, if you're taking the video aspect out, is essentially they're learning the same way you learned.
There's a lot of similarities, and very interestingly enough, School of the Air in Alice Springs, which was where School of the Air started, and it's the base. There are plenty of School of the Airs now around Australia, but the Alice Springs is the original one and the largest one, had people from all around the world calling it, seeking advice and assistance.
Oh, really?
On how to homeschool. What do we do? How do we do it? They had people from South Africa, from Switzerland, from Iceland, from the States, people up in Manchester in England, saying, we've heard about you. We know that this is, remote education is what you do. Can you please give us some tips? So for me, like talking to you now, I can't see you, Darren, and I can hear your voice. To me, that is the most normal way of communicating to anyone, because that's what I grew up with. So I have no fear or concern about that, whereas a lot of people, and a lot of kids initially really struggled with that, because if you are not used to being isolated in one form or another and needing your communication to take this limited form of just a voice, then it's it can be quite confronting. So for parents during COVID, they were, especially in Melbourne and Sydney and places where they had those long lockdowns, I think it was a nightmare, and homeschooling was really difficult. But yes, it wasn't that different to how we learnt all those years ago.
Although, and this prompts me to my next question, and it is a bit of a serious question, when it comes to schooling over the air, did you ever use the cattle destroyed my homework as an excuse, as opposed to the dog?
Well, variations thereof. Yeah, definitely.
We probably had a few more options under your belt out there.
Well, we had a lot of options because the number one impediment to our schooling was our father. So we had this tiny little stone schoolroom, this little room. It was just me, my sister and my brother, and a governess who was a young girl who supervised the written lessons and oversaw the half an hour each day we had on the radio. And this little room sat outside the homestead, and we'd hear the crunch, 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 crunch of my father's boots, walking through the stones towards the schoolroom. And we knew what was happening. He was about to come and pull us out because he had cattle to muster, or he needed somebody sent out to a fence to fix a floodgate, or he needed a bore worked on. And we kids were his workforce. We were his mainstay. And, you had a lot of stockmen that came and went, but a lot of stockmen were drifters. They'd come for a time, then they'd go somewhere else. So the kids, not just us, all bush kids on all cattle stations, I think around Australia, but particularly Central Australia, were like the mainstay of the workforce. So the biggest problem would be Dad dragging us out, and we could be gone for an hour to a day. And sometimes he'd just say, right, that's it, we're going to the stock camp. And my poor mother would be there throwing up her hands, because stock work came before everything, and certainly came before schooling. So we had horses, we had dogs, we had cattle, we had any number of excuses to say this, effectively ate our homework or stopped us doing our homework. And then what we then had to do when we could was we had to make it up on the weekend. So school was Monday to Friday, 7:30 in the morning till 1 o'clock in the afternoon, because the afternoon needed to be free for us to be able to work. So our whole lives were work. And if we had to go out in the mornings, then weekends would be entirely spent in the schoolroom making up for lost time.
Oh no, just to rub a little bit of salt in the wound. But I guess if anything's going to interrupt the learning of life, it's going to be life itself, isn't it? That's a fair interruption. Nicely
put. And that, that's right. Out there on the back of a horse at age 7, mustering cattle for miles on end in the stinking heat. Oh God, 45 degrees and above day after day. We're little kids on these big old stock horses galloping after cattle out there all day, and then often day after day with hardly any water, food. You learn very quickly about life. You become tough. You have to become tough really, really quickly to survive.
Well, my initial reaction then was to say, wow, what a dream come true, being able to ride horses. But then I forgot 45 degrees is very hot, and suddenly the glamour just dropped away pretty quick.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of glamour. It was filthy, exhausting, hard work. I mean, for us kids, it was all so exciting. There was nothing like galloping along on the back of a horse with the wind in your hair, chasing cattle up, a stony ridge or through a dry creek bed or through some mulga scrub. That the chase was always exciting. Galloping on our horses was exciting. But most of cattle work was really hard work, because once you went through the chase and you got cattle together, then you would spend hours what we call droving them back to the nearest dam or the nearest water hole or bore, and that could be hours and hours and hours of just sitting on the back of a horse at the tail of the cattle. The dust, I don't know if you've ever smelt bull dust, but there's nothing like it, and it gets in your clothes, your hair, your skin, and you're filthy and covered in red dirt from top to bottom.
Wow. Yeah. No, I mean, I've been in some dusty places, but no, I can't say I've been anywhere near something like that bull dust that you just described, and I'm sure it's something that is not easily forgotten.
It's not easily forgotten. If you live with cattle in any kind of dusty places, but of course the outback, Central Australia, is, well, it was originally the bottom of the sea, and now Central Australia itself is this amazing geological formation of McDonnell Ranges, these huge granite ranges rising out of the earth, and lots of gullies and hills around it, and then either side it flattens out for hundreds of miles. So it's desert country, and you put cattle together with desert country, and the result is a lot of bull dust.
And it is incredible to sort of contemplate or try to wrap my head around that it was an inland sea. And I know before we started recording, we were having a real brief chat about Andamooka and how isolated that place is. But when you start digging underground, of course, you get through the gypsum layer, and then you get to a certain level where that's where you find old sea animal fossils and bones and teeth, and you think, what? You're in the middle of this super dry, dusty desert, and you're chipping through the remnants of ocean creatures.
Yeah, it's very, very bizarre. Every now and then out here we'd find little remnants, not very often, because the wind mostly had removed the topsoil and removed of anything that might have been there, but every now and then. And out to the east of Central Australia is this amazing area where they've discovered remains. Now this is later than the sea time, it's the time of dinosaurs, but there's extraordinary remains of these huge prehistoric animals that then lived here after the waters dried up. So it's a fascinating place. Fascinating.
Absolutely. And speaking of fascinating, I'm finding it fascinating, and I'm very curious. So growing up in that environment and schooling and educating yourself the way you did, how did you transition to what drew you towards aiming for the legal profession out there? And as part of that question, is it also correct that you were also the first School of Air lawyer, as far as someone has obtained their law degree?
Yes, first School of the Air student to graduate in law and go on to practice law.
That is awesome.
Yeah, I think back now and think, wow, that's actually quite something. It didn't seem anything unusual at the time because, like I said, when you're a kid, your life is normal. Everyone else's life is strange or unusual or abnormal, but not your own. So it's taken me a long time to realise, actually, that's pretty unusual.
Well,
and
somewhat of a U-turn from mustering cattle to screaming "Your Honour."
Yes, may it please the court.
Yes.
Well, there are a couple of reasons. Probably the primary reason is that despite growing up on a cattle station, spending most of my childhood on the back of a horse, I was a really bookish child. I was the only one of my family who loved learning, and I loved learning, and I particularly loved English and history. And so I read voraciously and learned about the outside world really through reading School of the Air library books and anything I could get my hands on. But when we finished primary school, we were all sent, like all bush kids are, sent like 1,000 miles away or so to boarding school, because there's no secondary education equivalent in the outback. So bush kids everywhere in the 60s and 70s had to leave home and go to these hideous prison-like institutions, which mine was like one of the leaders in hideousness. And it was like being locked inside a prison for 5 years. But what it did was gave me this extraordinary education. So because I was a bookish child and I loved learning anyway, the way I survived my homesickness and hating these prison walls was to throw myself into study. So I did well and got good marks, and my English and history remained my favourite subjects. And so at the end of matric, as it was called back then, year 12, two things happened. We were all trying to work out what we were going to do. None of my family had ever been to university. I knew nothing about uni, and I didn't know what I was going to do other than I really wanted to be a journalist or a foreign correspondent and travel the world and talk to people and write down their stories. That was, a combination of the history and English that I loved. But one of my fellow students, my long-term girlfriend, who's still my great friend today, she said to me, no, Tanya, you should do law. And I said, well, look, I don't know what law is, and I'm not interested in it anyway, because I don't know what it is. And she said, oh, Tanya, said, my sister's doing law, and if she can do law, anyone can do law. So
wow, that's a big statement.
So there was that, and then I talked to my teachers, and they said, no, you should do law because you'll get the marks for it. And at that time, journalism wasn't a university degree. It was like a cadetship. So you had to put down what you wanted to do, and then whatever your marks were, I don't know who the powers will be at the time in the South Australian education system, but they then allocated you according to your marks through to whatever your preferences were. And so I ended up by default in law, not wanting to do it, not knowing anything about it, and having spent, I must say, a career being a most reluctant lawyer, mostly using my career as a springboard to go off and do what I always wanted to do, which was travel and write stories about other people in other places.
Oh, beautiful. Well, at least it became a catalyst for some super adventures. But I'm glad you mentioned, that your original love was English, and I guess being somewhat of a reluctant lawyer, because I was curious. We're going to jump into your books, most definitely. And just before we do that, being a lawyer, I think, and I can only assume because I'm not a lawyer, but I'm guessing it means a whole lot of, I guess what you call sterile or legal writing. And,
yes.
And from my understanding and experience of that, by its nature, it's designed to be absent of any emotion or any sort of subjective considerations. So
yes.
But I'm wondering, when it comes to the artistic side of writing, so that creative writing, that passionate writing, the emotional writing, is that something that was a part of your life before your studies began? Like, so you writing as a child out
yes.
there on the cattle, or was it something that emerged from experiences once you started getting the academic, sort of adventure?
No, that's a very insightful question, Darren, and you're the first person who's ever made that point to me, because that, for me, was the biggest struggle throughout my life. In wanting to actually write. As a child, I wrote voraciously. I read voraciously and I wrote voraciously. And I wrote stories about kids on cattle stations having adventures. And
possibly based upon yourself.
Possibly based upon myself. But interestingly, all the books out of the Alice Springs School of the Air Library were books that had been donated sometime from somewhere back in the 30s and 40s, and they were all Enid Blyton stories of kids having adventures in England. So all my stories were adventure-based. They were kids in the bush galloping along after cattle, and then they'd head to this beautiful Cornish coastline and disappear down into a cave where they would chase the baddies and find the jewels, the treasure. Or alternatively, there'd be English children riding their bicycles, cycling along and eating ices, as they always seem to be doing, through meadows of daffodils, and then they'd reach a homestead and they'd have to go and fix some boars. It was this completely seamless and bizarre blend of the life I knew and the life I read about, and it all involved children. So my creativity was, as a child, it was at an all-time high. I just wrote and wrote and wrote stories. They just streamed out of me. Once I got to school and to high school, and you're trained to write analytically, then you end up in law. For me, that completely crushed my creative side, and I had to struggle to develop the analytical side because that wasn't my natural bent. I wasn't a natural analytical thinker, and I had to retrain myself to learn to be that in order to survive in law. And then once I finally wanted to start writing again, I had to work out how to go back to the other side of my brain and unlock that. And it was really difficult, Darren. It took me such a long time, and I still think in many ways I'm unpicking it, because decades and decades of practicing law messes with your creativity big time.
Well, I suspect it would definitely be, a filter that needs to be slowly pried loose because, descriptive words are usually not used unless they're, in a police report style. But
Yeah.
but it must also be really sense of rediscovery, and a lot of really liberating feeling to sort of return to that creative side after being on the dark side, for want of a better word, because I know it's not truly the dark side, but let's say the non-colourful side of the English language.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, interestingly now, this isn't to with my current 3 books, but I'm writing a 4th book, and it's fiction. My first 3 are memoirs.
Yes,
and I've set it here in Central Australia, and so they're not kids having adventures, but it's a young lawyer in the 1990s in Central Australia having adventures. So I'm playing with I don't know what the word is, unpicking, releasing, trying to allow back out that creative side of me that existed as a child. And I remember as a kid, the words would flow, and they're flowing again, which is really exciting. I don't know whether it's any good, but the words at least are flowing.
Well, it doesn't matter. You don't worry about whether it's good to start with, do you? It's just that joy of writing. And
yes.
If you have those breaks from writing, it can take. It's like anything. The momentum's lost, so it takes a little bit to get all the cogs moving and everything.
Yes.
The relation, everything working together, and then when the momentum slowly picks up again, it's so good, isn't it? You can feel all sorts of stuff coming to life, and electricity buzzing, and suddenly you've got 25 different ideas for one little part, and it's very exciting. So speaking of writing, speaking of the artistic side, and you just mentioned your 3 books of biography, so you have done 3 fantastic books, but I thought we'd go in sequence and start with the very first one called Alice to Prague, which I understand was published in 2019. And
yes.
Now, so Alice to Prague is centered around your teaching adventure in a Czech town that at the time you'd never heard of, and it's also partly described as being a story of the search for identity, which I'm guessing has a little bit to do also with some of the politics and discoveries made over there, which I'd like to touch on shortly. But I'm wondering, going from a Northern Territory lawyer to a teacher in Czech town, and having grown up how you did, how much of your identity today do you think that experience over in teaching over in a Czech town or in Prague, how much do you think that's shaped you today?
Another interesting question. I think it shaped me a great deal. It certainly shaped my outlook on life. I'd always wanted to go to Europe because of these childhood books. I'd wanted to be a travel foreign correspondent, travel journalist, travel the world, hear people's stories and write them down and bring them back and share. That's what I'd always wanted to do. So getting to Prague was in a way unofficially fulfilling that lifelong dream. So even though I wasn't a formal journalist, I set about learning and asking questions and diving into the history and finding out about the Czechs and their background, which was so much more extensive and both beautiful and barbarous than I could have imagined. Prague being this fairy tale city, the most glorious place I'd ever seen. It was straight out of a fairy tale children's picture book. So meeting the people there and learning about their culture, which unlike our Anglo-Saxon culture in Australia is already several centuries, but Prague was born from a vision of a princess in the 11th century, just to start with. So it shaped my thinking about how culture is so important. It creates societies, century upon century builds upon it. People become the culture becomes the people. And I found that absolutely fascinating because I'd come from such very different culture. But what really impacted on me was learning about the wars and the suffering and the oppression that the Czechs had been through, or Czechoslovakia as it was, similarly to Poland, similarly to all the countries that were either, at least in this last century, occupied by Hitler or occupied by Stalin, and how those people survived. and how resilient they were, and despite their grief and suffering and loss, how they still went on to make beautiful things and do beautiful things with music and language and architecture and dance, just really beautiful things. And it inspired me so much, and it opened my eyes to seeing history, which I'd always loved at school as being not just something that I wrote about at school in an essay, but something that was living and breathing. So my thinking about Europe was irrevocably changed during those 2.5 years, and I've gone back again and again and again, visiting, because I just loved it so much, and because I'm in constant awe at how people survive the most indescribable atrocities. And we were talking earlier about the impact on generations of such atrocities and how people survive. So yes, in terms of how it shaped my thinking and identity, it's certainly broadened my mind beyond anything I could have imagined, which was perhaps the greatest gift that you can have in life.
Yeah, well, I mean, my initial thought hearing you talk about that was, I think you probably did go over as a journalist. You just haven't done the report yet. So, but it must have been truly profound. Entering what would have the first time, I guess, sort of been something straight out of a fairy tale to begin with, but then also having that fairy tale lead to this huge discovery of just eye-opening facets of a whole different life. And it must have been just a huge adventure. And I can't imagine, I can imagine for myself, going from one city to another city, it can still be complete culture shock, and has been a couple of times. But to go from having lived in such a remote experience in such in a very beautiful and extreme environment, but to step into what as you mentioned, something that was originally designed by a princess and has probably been a part of your heart for a long time through literature. Wow, it must have been truly special.
It was just it was special. It was so special that when I came back, all I wanted to do was, quote unquote, write the story of the Czechs. I just wanted to take what I'd learned and write about it and share it with people here. And I was driven by that compulsion of what I'd learned, that people here, when I went, it was the 90s. And, this is all, computers were only just coming into being. There was no Google. There was, you found out about places through maps and you wrote letters. And so I was desperate to share everything that I'd learned so that people could know about what the Czechs had suffered and how they'd survived and how they hadn't and what they'd done. And I wanted to tell this story, which is what led to Alice to Prague, because I'd never been interested in writing memoirs. It had never occurred to me to write a memoir. And in fact, I started writing this as just the story of the Czechs. Okay. But eventually, when I got to talk to mentors and other writers, it became clear that I needed to weave my own story into it to give that perspective, to show how incredibly different the contrasts were, why it was actually so utterly appealing to me. And so that's kind of a report, but not the report I would have written if I'd been given my head. I never actually wanted to write myself into it at all, but anyhow, there it is, and here I am. Well,
it was probably better that it does. It is written as a direct reflection of your observations, because that means there's a whole lot of emotion in there, and probably a lot of emotions that readers can gel with, in the sense of, for a lot of us that haven't been there, we can sort of learn or live that discovery through your eyes as, fellow Australians and possibly people that had no idea what to expect going over there. Yeah. Whereas, as a journalist, and who knows, you may still write a report as a journalist for those experiences. So as a journalist is what I'll say, journalist/lawyer. But yeah, obviously then that would have been written a little bit different, because it wouldn't have been maybe highlighting emotions of others, but it may not have been written from an emotional side of things from your perspective. So
I think that's exactly why I kept getting the advice. I kept getting, people wanted the emotion into it, and how do you do that? Well, you weave your own experiences of it in there. And the other good thing about having done that was it was then just my take on it. It wasn't a historical review. It wasn't a factual report. It was my observations, which I think was a lot better, because otherwise I would have to have done proper research and put in footnotes and all sorts of things, whereas this was, my adventures, the adventures of Tanya in Prague.
Yeah, and the only references you need to put in are a couple of photos, if you wanted to put them in there. Now, in part of the description, I found it really interesting that you kind of hint that with your democracy and your communism and all that sort of stuff, and the sort of, I don't know, I guess you could say the education we received here in Australia at that time coloured images in a certain way, and you kind of hint that when you went over there and as you sort of got to know the people and the places and the politics and the events, that it turned out it wasn't quite what we'd been led to believe over in Australia. I experienced something similar, the first time I went and had the opportunity to work over in China, and sort of I had in my head things that I'd learned in the 80s and 90s as far as what to expect, and none of it was at all accurate. So is that something that you think was a big sort of shock to the system when you got there, or was it something that emerged sort of as you got to know the place and became more familiar with the day-to-day life?
I definitely think when I arrived and I ended up in this little Czech town called Sedlčany, all my prejudices came to the fore, because I grew up with my father and his generation had, they were children during the war, and then Reds under the beds, as it was called. The fear, the absolute terror of communism was extreme. So, my mother was beside herself that I was going to this communist country, even though I went because I actually saw the Berlin Wall fall, and that so inspired me. And communism had been, I don't know how you'd actually say it, but officially communism ended 4 years before I went. So in the Velvet Revolution of December 1989, and I got there in 94. But still, my mother and people saying, you're going to a communist country, or at least a former communist country, people won't have changed their spots. You'll be in so much danger. You'll be taken off to a gulag and never seen again. These kind of real fears, which of course, I was young and like, whatever, that's just what old people say. But when I got there, I realized and looked around, this town, Sedlčany, had been hugely oppressed by its Soviet masters, and people were living in these hideous panelakis, these big concrete tower blocks, some of the same you've seen being destroyed in the Ukraine. It was the communist architectural signature, house everyone into these tiny places and then just let them out to work. And that's really what I did find. And so I was expecting kind of the communist legacy to be very real, and it was. But then two things happened. Under that, I discovered, probably like you in China, that of course that was just a political regime, had nothing to do with the people. The people themselves were warm and generous and kind, and exactly like me, and I was exactly like them. We were just human beings all wanting the same thing: love, friendship, family, good food, a decent bed, a life worth living. The second thing I found, though, which was very confronting, was they equally had their prejudices of me from the West. So when I got there, a lot of the locals were very suspicious of me, would not look at me, wouldn't talk to me, had nothing to do with me, because I represented the evil capitalist West. And I was in this town, it had about 8,000 people. It was once this beautiful, beautiful village at the bottom of the valley, and the Soviet masters in their wisdom had decided it was very useful. It was a very useful spot for an industrial town, and they'd built all these chimney stacks in the base, in the valley of this beautiful old town, along with these hideous panelaki. And so the the little valley in winter when I arrived was completely covered in brown coal smog. And brown coal's the cheapest and most revolting, with a smell I'll never forget. And people died all the time during winter of respiratory failure. And I was so sick for about a month. I lost my voice. I was in bed. I've never been so sick in my life. And being alone in a place where you can't speak the language, you don't know anything, I was really terrified, especially when I knew there was so much resentment that I was there. And if anything had gone wrong, what would have I done? I thought I could have died there, and I could have died and nobody would have known for days or weeks, and my parents would never ever see me again. So it was very interesting seeing those preformed political views that we had, both sides coming out of the Cold War, because I was there 4 years really after the Cold War officially ended, but of course it hadn't ended, and it decades really to let go of prejudices on either side and fears. So it was interesting to see it playing out before my eyes, and also being subject to it myself, as locals there viewed me with enormous suspicion and hostility.
Yeah, and it's such a really interesting point you raised, because some of the misconceptions that we can have, it like I said, there is the flip side to the coin, and that is that other nations, other cultures can equally have misconceptions about the way we live, or the values that we hold dear to us, and the politics of the day surely can just muddy what would be essentially, I like to think of cultures as crystal clear rivers or creeks,
Yes.
wherever you want to put it, and politics enters and they're like just mud banks that dirty the water. Whereas if we just didn't have those mud banks, the creeks would just feed into one another, and we'd have a beautiful, raging, stunningly crystal clear, amazing river. But we don't. We have little mud tracks everywhere because of politics. But
well, that was one of the drivers for me when I came home. I wanted to tell the story of the Czechs for many reasons, but I think the overriding reason was I wanted to tell Australians how these people were just like us. We were all the same. We were all human beings. We spoke a different language and lived in a different place, but that was it. The politics did not define us as human beings, define us. And when I ended up in Prague, and because I was a lawyer, I was teaching legal English to the Minister of Justice and judges of the High Court, which was extraordinary. Wow. And I remember having these sessions in a local pub with all these Czech judges, many of whom were women, because of course they didn't have the glass ceiling per se there, because everyone had to work under communism. But everyone's sitting there together. We're all drinking wine. We're all saying, well, there would have been no Cold War if it was left to the people, and there would have been no Cold War if it was left to we women. And all we're all clinking glasses and drinking this bull's blood and laughing and just connecting in this incredible way. It was so precious. I wanted to jump up and shout out to Australia and everywhere else, look, we're all the same.
Considering you're dealing with some pretty powerful people over there, but you definitely found common ground, the boozy business lunch. I'm glad to hear that's similar all around the world.
all round the world. Yeah. A good glass of wine just releases borders everywhere.
But that would have been pretty amazing to. I mean, I don't even understand, how do you find yourself in a position where you're teaching that sort of information to, because obviously the Cold War, like I said, it technically ended 5 years or so beforehand, but legal side of things I would have thought would have been something that would still be somewhat protected to the point where they wouldn't want that outside influence, because obviously judges and lawyers have essentially shaped laws and rules, don't they, for a country? So that's a very interesting position to find yourself in.
Well, it was, particularly because the government under Soviet control had made all the rules, made all the laws, and had imposed them, and the courts under communism had very little say. So the legislature completely ruled, and they had to implement those laws. Whereas when I was there, they were just moving their way out of it and through it, and starting to look at the West, which has common law, and looking at laws that aren't politically driven, but that are more human rights connected or focused or driven. So it was interesting to learn that under communism, it would have been not much fun being a judge, but how they were thoroughly enjoying the transition. Well, it wasn't easy. It certainly wasn't easy, but the more progressive ones were excited about that.
And so potentially you've played quite a big role, or had some very long echoes, or your visits have probably had some reverberated long through the political, or at least the legal system over there.
Yes, yeah. And so I wrote about that in my book, Alice to Prague, as well, because I found it fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I would love to have been more powerful, and so being able to come back to Australia and arrange judge exchanges or something like that. But I was sort of a nobody, so I wasn't able to do that. But, to have exchanges between the judiciary and the legal system, between countries, especially countries emerging out of, dictatorships, which is effectively what communism was, into more human rights based law, is fascinating. It's so important for the onward progressive development of countries, to take them out of living under totalitarian regimes. And so to have had exchanges like that would have been wonderful. And we talked about it. Maybe one day it will happen.
Well, I mean, I think it's just astounding that and beautiful that, instead of coming back to Australia maybe bitter or disillusioned or frustrated, you've come back excited, hungry, and to the point where, and positive enough that you think, wow, now we want to exchange judges. And so I think that's a really good way to be coming back.
I also came back to Australia incredibly grateful to be a lawyer. When I went away, I was pretty disillusioned by law, but I came back with a renewed gratitude for democracy and the Westminster system that ensures that the judiciary is separate. There's a separation of powers between the legislature and the judiciary, that the government of the day doesn't rule the courts, and that there's that independence. And to have that sense of democratic freedom in our judicial system was something I'd taken for granted and really appreciated when I got back. And the fact that I could practice as a lawyer without being told what area I had to practice in, or to have had my chances to become a lawyer dictated by whether my family, were favoured by the communists or not, or we'd done something to earn their displeasure or not. I got the chance to be a lawyer just of my own volition, which was, all of that was really eye-opening. And I came back with such a profound sense of gratitude for the freedoms we have here.
And isn't that funny? So in essence, an absence of the heart, an absence made the legal heart grow fonder. So,
Yeah.
but now, speaking of heart growing fonder, now, as a lawyer, you can, obviously you may choose to neither confirm nor deny, as they say, as Americans coined. But would I be right in guessing that there was possibly also a little romance to be found in
Yes, there was indeed the grand passion. The Czech man with blue eyes who quoted poetry under the stars and played guitar in the moonlight and took me on hikes through forests and opened me up to the culture, this extraordinary culture of Prague and its beauty. Yes, it was a grand passion, swept me off my feet. And I part of me wanted to stay there forever. But like all good fairy tales, reality kicks in at some point, and eventually I had to come home. But it remained this incredible love affair, for which I was so grateful, because Karel was his name. He gave me Prague. I would not have had the insight to Prague and learned as much as I did and been able to go to the places I went had he not facilitated that for me. I would have remained an outsider, but I became part of the Czech community. It was precious beyond words.
It's one thing to go behind the Iron Curtain, but to go behind that curtain that divides, what would your general tourist experience to something where you become entwined in people's lives and the heart and beat of and the rhythm of everyday life. That's awesome, and it definitely sounds like things came full circle in the sense of, you know, having designed for a princess, and then you have a fairy tale. What did you say? Grand Passion?
The Grand Passion.
Yeah. Well, that sounds pretty epic. Well, I'm not going to dig any further for information because that, I'm sure, is something that, you know, the listeners out there are going to want to jump right into, whether it be, you know, the adventure of going there for the first time, to the romance, to sitting and talking legal aspects with judges and, you know, all those things in between. That sounds like a spectacular book. So obviously Alice to Prague is the book for all of our listeners out there who want to share in all those adventures and discoveries, and of course a little bit of romance, which again we won't delve into because that will be the discovery for our readers. Now the next book that was in your trilogy so far is called An Alice Girl, and that was published in 2020. That one, chronologically, it actually takes a step back, doesn't it? It
Yes.
brings the reader back into that outback and big sky world that was your playground growing up. And you mentioned earlier how, you know, a lot of the experiences that you had growing up didn't seem out of the ordinary or anything because it was just what you knew and that was your whole world, and there wasn't, you know, besides, you know, just learning about other countries or cultures through books, but the actual lived experience that's all you knew. And, you know, for me growing up, there was always this feeling that, you know, the city and the suburbs, that was kind of where life was really happening, so to speak, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And there was always this sort of underlying feeling that in the outback and in those farming community towns, that there was this thought that a lot of people there, they mainly were working hard but dreaming of moving to the big smoke. Now, you know, as I've grown a bit older, I think that's, to me at least, it's proven to be a bit of an illusion, that feeling, where I think a lot of people, given half the chance, would love to be at least move out of the hustle and bustle. So, you know, you said that it was, you know, your lived experience was you weren't, you know, sort of aware of any other options, so to speak, without, to not put it so bluntly, but as in, you know, there were no other options on the table. But was there ever that feeling growing up, you know, back in those awesome, hot and bull dusty days, that did, you know, as you got a little bit older, prior to the move to the boarding school, was there a feeling of were there days where you thought, you know what, I'd like to be in Sydney or in Melbourne or in Adelaide or in Perth or at least go visit? Never.
Never. All those big places a long way away were just in someone else's world. No, my world I loved. It was my whole existence. And not only did I not really know about anywhere else, I didn't, apart from my storybooks, that was different. They were overseas lands, so they were exciting, and I knew I wanted to go there when I grew up. But when I was a kid in the bush, you know, it was true, long, hot days mustering, like, anywhere but here. But the place I wanted to be was back at the homestead, where we had big gum trees, and Mum had this cooch lawn that she kept alive, and I'd lie under the gum tree with my storybooks, and, you know, I'd write stories, and that was my favourite place to be. So I never wanted for anywhere else, never needed anywhere else. And like all cattle stations, they were a community. So we had a lot of people living there. There was my family, there was our teaching governors, but there were stockmen, lots of stockmen. There was a bookkeeper. Sometimes you'd have a camp cook. My mother would be cooking for up to 20 blokes for each meal, huge slabs of beef, enormous amounts of food. And so as a kid, there were all these characters. None of the people who worked there were just boring, middle of the road.
I don't suspect they would have been. No.
They were all characters from everywhere, and drifters and loners, and they all told yarns that would go on for hours. And some of them had guitars and taught us kids, you know, how to play the guitar and sing songs. And we all played country music. And so, no, this community that I lived, it was my world. And I think that's what made being sent off to boarding school so hard, because I wasn't just leaving a home or a family, I was leaving a whole world that was self-contained.
Kind of makes me think of, I'm not sure if you're familiar of a movie, I think it was this late 70s movie called The Last of the Knucklemen.
The Last of the
Knucklemen.
No.
which is it's kind of set in the outback, and I think it's got it's got Jack Thompson and a few others, but it's more a case of all the drifters that come together to work on different stockers, and just the antics and how they sort of, you know, the fights and the day-to-day struggles, and you know, everyone holding their cards close to the chest, and but at the same time each being these unique characters and all from different walks of life. So yeah, it definitely doesn't sound like it was ever boring out that way, especially growing up and having a beautiful, nice, cool place to, you know, lay under a tree and read a book. That's the cherry on the proverbial outback cake.
Yes, beautifully put, Darren. Couldn't have put it better myself. Absolutely. Yeah.
In An Alice Girl, in part of the description, you actually mentioned that your father played a major part in teaching you how to survive in what was obviously a severe and isolated environment. And so I wouldn't mind picking your brain a little bit, Tanya. So what are some of the elements of day-to-day survival tips, or what tips would you might have when it comes to the extreme outback that a lot of us may not be aware of? I mean, I dabble a little bit in here and there, and I've had out, but I still wouldn't say I'm aware of any. You know, if I had to live out there without all my mod cons, I'd have to sort of pull out an instruction manual, which I don't have yet. So, but what would be some sort of day-to-day survival tips like that? That was just a normality there growing up, that maybe are still vital tips today that many of us could probably benefit to have in our back pocket of, in our life instruction manual.
Well, I suppose he taught us two sorts of things. The first was the physical, how to survive the physical. Now, bear in mind, there were no air conditioners. There were, no super duper cars. We went everywhere in battered old Land Rovers or Toyotas on the back mostly. And when we were out bush mustering, there was nothing, there was no protection whatsoever. So the survival was learning how to go without water. That was his first and most profound instruction, which is counterintuitive. It makes no sense. But his view was that if you drank too much water, you'd get soft and it would make you want more water. And so you couldn't get the water, so you'd perish and die. In the outback, the number one fear, that the number one thing that will take you out is sun and the dehydration. So how do you survive? Well, you learn to survive by not needing so much water. And we learned to suck stones to try and keep moisture in our mouths. We'd have an orange, which was an old Aboriginal trick. We'd have a little saddlebag on our horses, and in that we'd have an orange. So we'd eke that orange out when the opportunity came. You'd just make a hole in it, you'd suck on it slowly. You'd always have a hat, and you just had to be tough, and you couldn't complain, and you had to put up with flies. And I mean, it was, I don't think many people today could survive the outback of then, to be honest, because we've all got really soft. Me in particular, I'm now used to air conditioning and fans, and so there was that bush thing. It was it was mental, as in we had to control ourselves mentally. We had to control our minds. You will get these cattle through to the dam by the end of the day, because that's where water is for you, your horse and the cattle. And if you don't, you'll perish and die. So it was that mental sense of there's no alternative. You have to push on, never give up.
And I thought it was a big bike ride to the fish and chip shop when I was a kid.
Yeah. So, that was really hard. And there were a couple of times, there were so many times actually, I reckon I nearly perished. And one occasion where I do write about it in An Alice Girl, and Dad actually saved me on that occasion. But the physical was, you basically had to learn to live with it, and you had to just toughen up in every sense. But the corollary of that the second part of that, I suppose, that he taught me, which is internal, is that sense of you must keep going no matter what. And there are so many times in life I wanted to give up on things, and I felt like I was failing, or I was useless, or it was hopeless, or I was hopeless, waste of time, etc. But that old adage, you cannot give up. You cannot give up. You have to see something through. You have got to get those cattle back to the dam to water. So it's taught me a resilience and given me a determination. My brothers and sister are exactly the same. And so it means that, for example, when I was in Sedlčany in that Czech town, and I was so sick and I thought I was going to die, the only thing that kept me going was Dad's voice in my head. You will not give up. You cannot give up. You see it through. And it would be the biggest shame job, which is the term we used to use, if you didn't. Like, if you gave up, it was the ultimate shame job. Absolute, like, worst thing you could ever do. There'd be no pity. There'd just be, shame on you. So, yeah, they were very tough childhood lessons, but in life I've been able to apply them. So, for example, to my writing, we were talking about how hard it is to go from, whether it's the left brain or the right brain, I can never remember which one's the creative side and which one's the analytical side, but teaching myself to think analytically to be a lawyer, and then unteaching myself that, or trying to reopen the creative side so many times I thought I couldn't do it. And in writing these books, I had so many rejections because I didn't know how to write. I didn't know how to craft a story, and it took me a long, long time. It took 15 years to write Alice to Prague in between working full time, and 30 rejections minimum. It was endless. And talk about wanting to give up, but it was that sense of, you have to get the cattle back to the dam. You've got to find a way. So that's the sort of other part to it. I think you've got to keep going, but you also have to find a way to do it mentally. And for me, that was reaching out and finding other writers and mentors and getting advice and help. That's a long-winded answer to your question.
No, I think
Sorry, Darren.
That was an amazing answer, and it revealed so much. I mean, I guess I, to a certain degree, I can understand what your father was sort of teaching when it came to like water usage, because obviously, why would you want to be a palm frond if you can be a succulent?
Yeah.
Because one of them's going to survive and one isn't out there.
Yeah.
And but not only that, isn't it fantastic? Well, most of the time, it's not always the best thing, but I've found that it's a really good tool, and that is to have the freedom to, when it comes to setting a pathway for success, or at least the opportunity for achievement, to have the choice to give yourself no choice.
Yeah.
So you put yourself in a position where you have no choice but to succeed, or in this instance, that's such a powerful tool to have in your tool belt for life. To the mission ahead. Well, the cattle has to get to the bore, to the dam. There's just no other option on the table, and utilizing that in life, that must have given you some very powerful sources of motivation and inspiration, and no doubt has played a huge part in all these successes.
Well, it's certainly helped in law, because as you will recall from earlier in the conversation, I have been throughout life the world's most reluctant lawyer. I didn't want to do it. I didn't set out to do it. I did it reluctantly. When I was at uni, I kept trying to drop out and go off and escape to Europe, and my father wouldn't let me. I mean, he was quite terrifying. He had to be to survive this land up here. And so when I finally got through law and started practicing, the world was so unfamiliar to me. I knew nothing. It wasn't so I'd come from a legal family or I'd been involved in law in any way. I genuinely didn't understand the processes, how it worked. And it was completely male-dominated. There were almost no women. And because I'd been away in Adelaide for so long, 5 years at boarding school and then 5 years at law school, I was desperate to come back. So I came back and practiced in the Territory. And there were even fewer women here back then. So when I started, for example, in the second year I came down to Alice, there were 40 lawyers in Alice Springs. It was, a bustling commercial town, 4 of whom were women, and I was one of the 4.
Oh, okay.
So it was, and this was the 80s. It was so misogynistic. Oh, God, it was so tough, and sexism was just rife, and I'm very, very small. Like I barely hit 5 foot, and I'm a woman. So, it was just this uphill battle. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful for my father's mantra, because it would have been so easy to give up on law and think, I don't belong here. I can't do this. But in a sense, lawyers, being in the stock camp had taught me not actually how men think. I don't know if I'd be that bold, but they taught me how very hard men think. And so when I came up against a lot of hard men in law, I thought, you know what, I understand the kind of creature you are, because I grew up with that. So that was quite helpful in a way. And to survive in law, you have to be really hard. You either have to be cutthroat, or if you've got lots of compassion. There are a lot of great lawyers with lots of compassion, but then they develop very strong boundaries and detachment in order to survive. So learning to survive in that world and learning those skills was something I can really thank those early years for.
And considering what a physical, challenge it was growing up in that environment, I'm kind of curious, as when you stepped into the legal world, did you ever, well, even secretly, did you ever giggle at a criminal that might have been described as a hardened criminal, and you thought, hardened, come on, mate.
Yeah, exactly. You don't know hardened. If you'd been to some of the bush race meetings I'd been to and seen the amount of rum consumed and the fights that followed and the deals done and the gambling and the horse thieving and just the wild west combined into Central Australia. But yeah, that's not hardened. I know hardened.
I think you might. Definitely. Now, you have said a very special word to my heart occasionally, and that is Adelaide. And
yes.
So in 2021 you published, or the book Beyond Alice was published, and now that was chronologically following on from the outback
Yes.
adventures as a child, and that is obviously what you've already mentioned, going to a boarding school, which 1,600 kilometres away from home. I'm just wondering, obviously there's the obvious sort of transition issues and sights and sounds, but what were some of the biggest challenges? But equally, what were some of the things that you least expected to find as far as magical and truly cool discoveries? And also, why, besides, if you had to pick some major cities, why, of course, is Adelaide the best?
Well, the Northern Territory and South Australia were once one state. The Territory belonged to South Australia, and it was excised by the federal government back in about, I should remember the date, but somewhere around 1911. But historically, all those connections between the Territory and South Australia remained and remain to this day. So in Alice Springs in particular, Adelaide is essentially our capital city, not Darwin. Darwin is the top end, and it's the gateway to Asia. But even though it's the capital of the Territory, it's not perceived for most of the Territory as having any relevance. Adelaide is our capital. So that was always the case. Also, my parents grew up in the Flinders Ranges on salt country, sheep country, and they came up here as young pioneers after they got married. So all their connections were South Australia, and Dad had gone to boarding school. And so it was just when they got here, and of course all bush kids, as I said, had to go away to secondary school because there were no secondary options here. It was just a fait accompli. When I was 3 months old, I was booked in.
Oh, far out.
Yeah, because you had to, because there was such a long waiting list. Because, kids from all around the country, from all the states that lived out bush, went to boarding school. So from Alice, kids were either sent to Adelaide, the majority went to Adelaide, a few went to Queensland but that was almost always if the family had connections there. So that's why I went to Adelaide, and my initial impressions of Adelaide were completely clouded by the fact that I was in this stone-walled prison, which I hated, and my homesickness, there's no way to describe the tearing grief of being ripped out of this bush community and put into a tie and tunic inside a place of walls and rules and bells, and it was like a foreign land, but of the worst kind. And it was like being in prison. I
was going to say, your horizon was basically stripped from you. Eternally endless horizon.
And bush kids are really young. Like, we were little men doing big men's work. You're really responsible as a bush kid. You do adult stuff, And then you're a 12-and-a-half-year-old in a boarding school where you're not only sort of just one of a number like you would be in a prison, but you're deemed to be completely irresponsible, and so you're controlled. Every moment is controlled by rules and bells and punishments. So that was really the whole thing. And I'd never sat in a classroom before. I didn't know how to rule up a margin. I'd never played sport. I'd never been with other kids. But of course, that is precisely why bush kids get sent away, apart from the fact there's no schooling equivalent, but so that they can actually meet other kids and go into the outside world. So for me, the transition was grueling and traumatic and took me years to get over. Well, in fact, I don't think I've ever got over the fear of losing my freedom. I get panic stricken if I think I'm going to be shut in or locked in somewhere. And most of the bush kids I know who went to boarding school have the same fears even to this day. But of course, what it does is open your eyes to another world. And so Adelaide then, became the place I went to law school. And even though I was still homesick for the life I had back here, Adelaide suddenly became this wonderful playground, and Adelaide Uni was just a hoot. And suddenly there were these gorgeous places like the Botanic Gardens that you could sit in during spring and drink wine with all your fellow students, and you could perform in footlights. And the Adelaide Uni Theatre, and discovered there were places like the Hills that had wineries, and all sorts of different things slowly opened up to me. And Adelaide is still the place that I go to. Well, that's all my long-term friends still live there, and it's the place where I go if I have to go to a doctor, or a dentist is there, the accountant's there. A lot of people from up here have all their sort of businesses or health service providers in Adelaide, and go once or twice a year to deal with all those logistical issues. So it opened that opportunity up for me. And now Adelaide's the most grooviest place imaginable. Those fabulous little Peel Street and Lee Street with wine bars, and the festival and the Fringe. It's a very beautiful city. So, now I feel lucky, very lucky I had that experience. But I have to say, boarding school is not for the faint-hearted, and thank goodness there aren't boarding schools anymore like there were back in the 60s and 70s, especially girls' boarding schools.
Yeah, I have heard some not flattering tales of boarding schools here in South Australia through a couple of friends' parents, that have been found themselves in there. Some pretty horrible stuff. And look, I remember in high school, we had the school I went to in Adelaide, they had a boarding school, but obviously it was nothing like back in those days. But even growing up, at one point there was the possibility that I'd be sent to boarding school, and that was terrifying. And it wasn't like I was coming from the bush.
Yeah.
So even as a kid growing up, just the concept of boarding school, for whatever reason, I don't know where the seed sort of was first planted, but the idea was terrifying. So I could imagine that I'm not sure if you were looking forward to boarding school to start with, or was it always something that was kind of, a knot in your stomach when you realised that the time was coming soon when you had to go, or was it only once you sort of arrived that you realised, this isn't such a good idea?
It was probably all of the above. So there were a couple of things about it that intrigued me before I went, and that was all courtesy of Enid Blyton's books, Mallory Towers and St Clair's, all these jolly hockey stick romps of girls going off to boarding schools and having fabulous adventures on the Cornish coast. So I thought, that sounds quite interesting, but the thought of leaving home was overwhelming. And then when I got there, just nothing could have prepared me for it. I mean, you think feral bush kid. I lived in jeans and boots and a hat on the back of a horse day in, day out. Suddenly, I've gone from this freedom and hundreds of miles of space, empty space, to these tiny, narrow halls and rooms, and the bells, oh God, and the uniforms and the punishments for running in the corridor. I didn't understand. I didn't have any concept. I had no sort of mental infrastructure to transition me. It really was like going to another planet. So that was one of the reasons I wrote Beyond Alice, the third book. I was never going to write it because I thought I can't go back there. It's still too traumatic. But after An Alice Girl came out, loads of people from around Australia wrote to me and said, we all came from the bush. Thank you for writing An Alice Girl. That tells a lot of our story. You know, people had similar bush experiences, especially in WA and Queensland, northern New South Wales, northern South Australia. And many of them said, and we got sent to boarding school too. Please write that story. And so that was really what compelled me to do it. And I have had so many responses from people saying, you've written our story. Thank you. It was, you know, some of the best and worst times of my life, and finally somebody's written it, because there's no other story that's been written in Australia of that time of boarding school. In fact, when I wrote it, I gathered some of the boarders into like a little group, and because of social media and technology, we could join up once a week and share ideas and memories. I needed to do that to make sure my facts were correct and that my memories hadn't gone too skew with. And one of the girls said to me at the end, I wish we'd done this years ago. I would have saved myself hundreds of dollars in therapy.
Far out,
Yeah, so it was a very profound and healing and releasing experience writing it. And it also helped me finally see, you'd think, you wouldn't need to write a book to finally get this, but that's what really helped me finally see the benefits that I gained. I mean, I knew it intellectually. I knew in my head how lucky I was, but this way I was actually able to feel it as well.
And I'm guessing, looking back to it, it's probably worked out the best that, as far as the chronological order, it starts with the journey to what was essentially a fantasy land.
Yes.
Or a fairy tale, and then from there going from a child, and then that third book. So you've had all that time to get back to writing with emotion, and then obviously learning how to deal with those emotions, and then to write that book which features so heavily regarding that boarding school. It's probably worked out well that was your third book in the sense of So
I think so. It actually worked out extremely well for all the reasons you've just outlined. It's funny how life sometimes works out, and at the end everything is just as it should have been, in the right order.
It is. Sometimes the universe has a way of making it happen, but it is a dance, though. It doesn't do it on its own. You have to get in there and hit those dirt tracks, because sometimes the dance isn't there on the main street. But now, 3 of your books are pretty much a journey through your life, really, and through your life experiences. So, as a writer, how does it feel to have so far revealed so much to readers all around the world? And now, and you mentioned that you had a lot of feedback from fellow, bush raised audience. But as far as the readers of your book and the people that have got in contact with you, who do you think's been your greatest audience?
Well, it's probably half and half. I've had so many fabulous comments from people who grew up in the city who said, we love stories of the outback, love them, and we just love the fact this is a true one. And they've just been engrossed by it. Bush readers certainly utterly gratified that someone's told their story. But perhaps the comment that moved me the most was a Czech friend of mine who lives in Adelaide, Zdeněk Jaranek, and he was a refugee. He fled communism. He fled Prague when the Warsaw Pact meant the Russian tanks rolled into Prague, down Václavské náměstí, the Wenceslas Square, and he fled here with his family to Adelaide, and he read Alice to Prague, and he spoke to me, and he had tears streaming down his face, and he said, your journey of going basically to a foreign land as a foreigner, he said, you've told our story in reverse. You've told,
that's incredible.
Yeah, you've told the story of the immigrants, the refugees coming here, just in reverse. He said, but the difference was you were lucky. You could always go home, and we fled and knew we could never go back. And so, of all the readers of all the books, I think that comment perhaps touched me the most. So it's been a really varied response. I've had so many Czech people not just love Alice to Prague, but then love the stories of my growing up here because they find Central Australia exotic. You know, borders everywhere writing to me. I had this amazing experience. This gentleman wrote to me. He's 83, and he said, my wife went to boarding school. So she went at age 5, and she's 83 now. So this is much earlier than my time at boarding school, obviously. And he said, we heard about your book, and she devoured it. She wouldn't put it down. And at the end, she was weeping and said, this is my story. And even though it was decades earlier than, I think she went to school in the, 40s, 50s, something like that, I was telling her story, what she'd been through. She was a bush girl and she was sent, and even though she was sent at 5 and I was sent at 12, it was still her story. So those kinds of comments, you never know who you're going to touch, and I just treasure them. I feel so grateful that all those years ago, wanting to grow up to be a journalist, to go out and talk to people and write their stories and then share them in an unofficial way has come true through me being able to write these books. They're full of stories of people, and then to get feedback like that, it's magic, Darren, magic.
That's one other word for it is there, the magic. Yeah, 100%. And obviously you probably have some, well, I have no doubt you've had fantastic achievements and great feedback and wonderful experiences, within your legal career, and probably still have a lot to come. But I suspect that telling your story to the point so far you have, because I'm sure there's more stories to come, and having feedback like that from so many different audiences, different demographics, that has to be worth more than all the money in the world. Although, of course, we like to sell books, but still, that must be something truly special. Like you said, magic.
Well, it is. And we started our conversation talking about the awful impact of COVID on authors across Australia, and 2 of my books were published during COVID, the 2 of the 3, and so I really struggled. I haven't been able to get out there and tour with them and take them to the places that I wanted to. So being able to at least to get these kind of feedback, despite the limitations I've had on getting the book out there, is beyond precious. It's beyond any money. I've never written for the money. I don't think any authors write for money. They'd be sorely disappointed if they did. But
you're allowed to write for the hope of money.
Well, maybe one day. I just, my hope's just been to get the books published. So to get them published and to have Alan Unwin's faith in me for 3 books in a row has, been remarkable. But to get this feedback, it's worth more than anything. The
year is, for me, it's only just begun. I know we're already a little way into it, but there's still huge leaps and bounds to be found, and we're going to work harder at Australian Book Lovers. Our goal is to try and reach as many people as we can, and we're constantly reaching more people every week, every episode. Wow. And I hope that, I know that listeners out there that have had a bit of insight into your story and to a little bit of insight into what your books are about, and the journeys and the adventures and the experiences that have led to these 3 books, they're going to want to get them. So obviously we're going to talk towards the end of where everybody can find the books, but the books are Alice to Prague and Alice Girl and Beyond Alice. So I think it's only just beginning as far as the life of these tales, because there's so much there for so many people. And I love the idea of, exploring what the boarding school might have been like and just experiencing it after coming out of the bush. I think that's, just for me, that's probably where I'd want to start, because that sounds really fascinating and obviously a little scary too. Yeah. But all of the adventures sound fantastic. Yeah. But what I'm wondering is, now for we've got many listeners, but for some of the listeners out there that may not have yet had the opportunity to just get out there and explore the wonders of the outback, or spend time in those extreme but definitely beautiful surroundings, you're probably no better ambassador. So what sort of mystical and magical discoveries that have obviously touched your soul in a deep and profound way, what sort of discoveries are waiting to be found for those people that and why does it touch our soul?
Oh, I'd encourage anyone to come to Central Australia, because it has a pull on the heart that is that's linked back to the mythical Aboriginal dream time, And it's a place of such contrast, these magnificent, rugged granite mountain ranges just rearing out of the red earth and filled with gullies and creeks and gorges and water holes and just magical, untouched nature, hundreds of miles of unspoilt silence, this beautiful, beautiful landscape. It fills your soul coming here. Once you've been here and you've looked up at a night of stars and you've walked through some of these ancient gorges, you connect back to time itself, and you'll never forget it. And many people go away and are, so touched by it. Their lives are never the same. Central Australia has this magnetic pull. It's very hard to describe. It's very mysterious. It's very ancient. It's just so beautiful and linked, like I said, with the Aboriginal Dreamtime. So people come and visit the Red Heart. If you've never been out into this part of the world, this is truly what Australia is. I mean, we're surrounded by coastline, and the majority of people live on the coastline, but the heart of Australia is in the centre. And I think it behoves almost every Australian to make at least one journey inland, to feel the soul of this country, to know what this country really is.
I think you should be in charge of our tourism for a while.
Yeah.
No, because that was magnificent. And if that's not going to sell books, nothing can. So you couldn't have put anything. You were such beautifully put. And when it comes to, I love big cities. I love exploring cities. I love architecture and stuff. But for me, it's a case of say if I go to some funky city like Tokyo, or where there's the neon lights. There's everything you imagine about Tokyo. It feels like walking in a photo, and it's very easily captured by photo. But then I'm also lucky enough to have property out in the bush, or spend a lot of time having travelled across Australia and spent time in deserts and bush. That, and even here when I live head out to sea, it's similar. That feels like stepping into a painting. And
yes.
There's something about the night sky out in the country or out in the outback. And like I said, the contrast, the endless horizons, the huge skies, all of those things, they very, very much, I think they're very difficult to be captured by photo, as opposed to a city. A city atmosphere can be captured with photography. Very difficult. You can get spectacular photos, but still, I think that's why paintings get closer, because they're two very distinct experiences, I think. And if anything, being out, you just sold it to me, it's like stepping from a photo into a living, breathing painting.
Yes.
And could there be anything more beautiful than that?
Yes. And it's so vast. You're right. It can't be captured. Paintings come the closest, I agree, but it can't be captured. It has to be felt.
Yes.
It has
100%.
to be experienced.
Yeah.
So I encourage all of your listeners to visit Central Australia, because it will be a profound, life-changing experience, I'm sure. Just looking up at those night skies, nothing like it.
Well, who knows? Maybe as Australian book lovers can get a little bit more momentum and a little bit more steam, maybe somewhere in the near future is an Australian book lovers writers retreat.
Yes.
And maybe we can arrange it and book somewhere out in Alice Springs, because that I would love.
Yes. That sounds fabulous.
Tanya, thank you so much for being a part of the Australian Book Lovers podcast. It has been absolutely a treasure for me to have chatted with you today. And look, before we go, can you maybe let our listeners know where they can find more, read more about you, learn more about you, and obviously discover your books?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you, Darren, for the most extraordinary interview. I've never had an interview like this. It feels like it was a very profound and soul-filling discussion. I loved it. Thank you. So
thank you.
Well done, first of all, to you and Veronica for your incredibly hard and powerful work supporting authors with Australian book lovers. And my books, so you can get them anywhere, but my website is www.tanyaheaslip.com.au. Booktopia, if you just type in Tanya Heaslip, into Google, it will bring up my 3 books, and you can buy them anywhere. Because they're published by Allen and Unwin, you can go to any bookstore. If they don't have them in stock, they'll just order them in. Yes, otherwise online through places like Booktopia. And if you want to know more details about me, then my website, tanyaheaslip.com.au, and also Facebook, Tanya Heaslip Author. And I love people writing to me and telling me of their experiences. So many people write after reading my books and share their experiences, and I love that. So I encourage anyone who reads and wants to share their thoughts to write, because you can write through Tanya Heaslip Author or through my website, and I always respond.
That's so cool. So Australian Book Lovers listeners, the mission has been now passed on to you to bombard Tanya with writing from all around the world and letters and just a line to say hello. But no, Tanya, it has been truly special. Thank you so much, and fingers crossed we can do this again when your next adventure comes out.
Yes, thank you, Darren. Thank you so much. I've loved it.
What an amazing, amazing chat you had. I'm cursing that I had to pass the interview across to you, because Tanya sounds like she had so much to offer in all of those questions, and we thank her so much for giving us plenty of time to chat and hear all about her travels and her experiences, and just everything that she said was sparking ideas in my brain and giving me shivers thinking about some of the parallels, and particularly around the professional writing, sort of smothering creative writing. And I'd have to say, I know what that's about. So yeah, what a fantastic interview.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it goes without saying, I could have talked for hours, and some of the subjects that she touched upon are worthy of a podcast episode themselves. It's a separate chat onto their own.
Look,
so maybe that's something we can arrange in the future.
Perhaps, that's right. The Enid Blyton, the English book childhood, and all those damn groups of kids whizzing off on their bikes with, the dog, Timmy the dog, the famous 5, dashing off. What were their parents thinking? Sending them away on camping trips into the middle of the countryside on their own. However, they, found the treasure, stopped the thieves and murderers and all those kind of things. Yes, remember those well. But it does give you a sense that your childhood experiences do shape the adult you are, and your reading experiences as a child shape the child and then adult you are. Did you read a lot of horror as a child, Darren?
Good question. Yeah, I did. to the point where I believe there was an intervention at one point when I was in year 6.
Right.
So I just turned 11.
Yeah.
Because I think the book was called Incubus at the time.
Right.
Adult horror, and the teacher got a bit concerned when, I was that kid. We had those. We either had the lift up desks, or we had this, the slide like with your alcove underneath desks.
Yeah.
And I always had a horror book, and in class I would kind of sit back a little bit, and then I'd be reading instead of paying attention in class. And they put up with it a little bit, but eventually it got a bit too much. And of course, all my horror books. And I remember I got in trouble I'd hound the local video store and for all their horror movie posters, and then I'd cover all my school books on the horror movie posters. And it was determined that probably wasn't the best idea. So, bummer. Yeah, those posters would be worth hundreds of dollars now, but nonetheless.
Yes.
No, not just horror. I read all sorts, but it's just a case of, it just opens, like talking to Tanya, who was just amazing, and just the wonderful concept that she sort of allowed me to contemplate, and that is, understanding the possibilities of the world around you that come from reading a book, because you can only know your immediate environment by your stimulus, your input, and if you without books, then how do you know what's happening outside the world? And without books, how do you develop that hunger and thirst and want to take on a quest to discover more, to discover those countries, to discover those cities, to discover those cities here, even in Australia, or different ways of life? It's the books are the key to wanting to branch out.
It's interesting. I wonder how the kids feel now, and like when, kids who have the access to internet, etc., and the global village that we live in, how they will feel about it when they're older and the worlds that they tap into. I very much appreciated Tanya talking about pre-internet and pre-mobile phones, because we did have to look stuff up in the dictionary. Our world was just our world, and the world in our street was different from the world 2 blocks away, and the world 2 towns away, and the world 2 countries away. But I do like the fact that she talked about our similarities that bring us together. Despite language and geography, we have so much in common. And she particularly was talking about the Czech people, where she spent she went overseas during her adventures, and I think that is just so relevant, that we are humans. And yet, after I heard that, I remembered I'm currently reading The Expanse. I'm up to book 7 of S.A. Corey's gigantic epic sci-fi series, and it's kind of 30 years after, sorry, spoilers for anybody who's reading it, and this is not in the TV series, by the way, this is after the TV series. So 30 years after the alien gates have opened 13 million new worlds to humans, they've kind of still reverted to our selfish and power-hungry and aggressive tendencies. And so it's kind of disappointing, as lots of the worlds are kind of settled in the same image as many of the places are now. And I thought, oh, that's a bit sad. I'd much rather go with Tanya's optimistic, yes, we have much more in common than our differences.
Yeah, no, I think so. And well, I guess 13 million planets. I think if you take carbon, protein, add a little bit of electricity, you're always going to get just a reason to kill, isn't it? Really, but and it's simmering in the background. It's just what we do. But what Tanya really made me think about was the identity of because you got from Alice to Prague, so you got this lady who grew up in a cattle station, and that's such a unique lifestyle. It may as well be. It could for me growing up. That's the equivalent of living in the Sahara, or maybe growing up in the Amazon rainforest. It's not an experience I had, and yet as an Australian we kind of adopt so many aspects of that lifestyle as part of our identity. And I know we talked a little bit about this off air, but I find it interesting that to Australian, we talk about the farms and the cattle and going out bush and stuff like that. But for many of us, that's not an experience that we actually get to be a part of.
It's interesting that even in the house next door, you can have such a different experience. I remember as a kid, an Italian family moved in next door to us. The older people died, and there was a young girl my age, and it was just brilliant to be exposed to that fantastic culture and to be invited in and have their whole backyard full of vegetables, to go to their sauce making days and to watch her mum make pasta. And I mean, that was just amazing. She just lived next door and it was completely different. So yeah, across countries, just also very different.
And of course, the more things change, the more things are the same. The more things are different, the more they're the same as well.
Yeah.
It's just like comedy or humour. You can break I think when you're somewhere where there's a language barrier, humour can break the ice. I mean, you always say break the ice with humour. If something funny
or
happens,
a glass of wine, as
a
Tanya
glass of
would
wine,
say.
yes. But if you see something funny happen, then you both laugh, even though you may not speak the same language. As soon as you share a bit of humour, then it's kind of like, okay, we have a bond now. But I just find it fascinating, to hear Tanya's story, and then to it made me really appreciate the different lifestyles, the different upbringings, the different realities that have made up. We've only got a small population, and yet there's millions of different stories, and yet we all carry around a part of other people's stories as our identity. I think as Australians, we all would consider ourselves beach people, we'd all consider ourselves country people. We all, there's all a little bit, the Akubra and the R.M. Williams is still part of our identity. But for most of us, many of us might only go to the beach once or twice a year, and none of us never have been to a cattle station. And yet it's kind of our identity, and that was a unique thing to look at as far as what it means to be Australian. That's what ultimately it boiled down to for me. Talking with Tanya and then going, okay, what does it mean to be Australian? And I don't have the answer to that.
I think there are, many, as many people as there are who identify as Australian. That's as many ways that it is. And really, how lucky that she grew up around Alice Springs, for those of you overseas who are listening. And the Red Centre of Australia around that area is absolutely magic. The air is different, the soil is different, the country feels different. And to go and look at the stars out in the middle of Australia is just purely magic, because it's so dark and the stars are so bright. I mean, they're a bit brighter up here than down in Melbourne. People often say that when they come out to our place, but Alice Springs, or out in the Red Centre, around Uluru and Katajuta and all those beautiful places, just brilliant, and does make you feel closer to so many of the Indigenous dreaming stories, that Tanya was talking about, the connection to country and all of those things that give each of us our own unique Australian experience.
Oh, 100%, yeah. I think, look, it's just one of those things, isn't it? It's all about getting back to, when you do get back to nature, it goes without saying that you will get to experience, I won't say eternal, but I'll say timelessness and a primal experience,
the belonging is important, I think, for humans. That sense of community is important, but I think the country belonging is also really important.
I think it's good for the soul, for anybody to go out for a couple of days where the only noise is the noise of nature, the ambience of nature, whether it's the wind through the trees or whether it's a breezeless evening and, the bugs coming out or the rustling in the bushes of bush turkeys or, the thud of kangaroos and, all the different sounds and smells and those beautiful things that there's a part of your body or part of your mind, I think, that thrives on them. Of course, that's why we all like going camping. Well, most of us, it's a beautiful thing. So to grow up in an area where you're constantly under the stars and constantly out in that nature, it's such a different experience to growing up in a city where it's cars and it's radio stations and it's top 40 and it's, fast food, and it's a completely different ballgame. But, again, I'm not going to try and put my finger on what it means to be Australian or how it feels to be Australian, but I suspect that one aspect that may play a strong role is just that ability to, for me who has grown up in one particular way and Tanya another, but we can have a chat and just have so much fun and talk as though we have shared experiences even we haven't. And I think that's such a beautiful thing and was a wonderful thing to experience. And I think that's what I love about, well, I won't say it's being Australian, because again, that's something I can't put my finger on, but I love being Australian in the sense of, like I said, none of us, we don't want to fight, we don't want to go to war, we're not too worried about the bigger issues. It's more of a case of, how did you make that pasta? Or
That's it.
Just sharing, and we can all sort of have a laugh and stuff. So and I had a laugh definitely, but I can tell you definitely that interview left me with a big smile on my face, that's for sure.
What an amazing woman and a fantastic author. When I looked at her books, I thought, interesting, but when I listened to her talk about it, and I really hope that readers do take the time to listen to authors and their interviews. So hearing more about them just deepens, peels back some of the layers of what goes into writing a book. And somebody like Tanya, it's her heart, it's her soul, it's her experience, it's her expertise, all of those things.
Absolutely.
Lovely. I wanted to ask you, what quotes did Tanya inspire with her chat?
Oh, certainly. So when it came to today's quotes, I was actually thinking about, the identity, I guess.
Right.
What shapes our identity as a person and as a society and as a nation. So that was kind of not that it got too deep and meaningful in the quotes, but that was definitely the inspiration for it. What about yourself?
So I was looking at life and adventure, because it really sounded like Tanya had seized adventure with both hands and jumped in feet first.
Let's just say the very least.
All right, so I'm going to give you my first one, which is from Sophia Loren. And look, see there, I was talking about my Italian neighbours who are fantastic friends to us. Sophia Loren is, of course, an Italian actress. Do you know Sophia Loren?
Of course I do.
Before your time, of course you do.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Because she is, in fact, 87 this year, according to Google.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. However, she said, it is better to explore life and make mistakes than to play it safe. Mistakes are part of the dues that one pays for a full life.
Yeah, and I think that ties nicely to our most recent episode prior to this, 43, with Jake O'Donnell, which was talking about those pivotal first moments, many of which are inevitably going to be mistakes of some kind. Well, at least that from looking back through the lens of time in my life, it's definitely full of mistakes. But yeah.
But yeah, just don't sit back. And look, it's tricky given the lockdown and COVID and everything that we've become a little bit more risk averse, I think. And certainly there are industries where people are risk averse, health being one of them. But better to explore life and make mistakes than to play it safe, because mistakes are part of the dues that you pay for a full life. And I think that's a really fair quote.
Yeah, and of course playing it safe essentially means, when it comes to life, obviously you need to play it safe when it comes to gambling and stuff like that, but life in general, there's probably a nice safe path to walk on. But mistakes, I like to think of mistakes as that super sharp machete. You're chopping your way through and making your own pathway.
So trimming the rough edges off.
Yeah, you're going to get a little bit bloody,
Nice.
you're going to get a little bit scratched up, and you may spark a few sparks into the air if you hit a rock and have to turn around and make a different direction, change the pathway. But at least you're off that path.
Yeah.
True. And plus you make it a little bit easier for some people to, maybe take a new direction and then veer off your path to their own adventures. So yeah, don't risk. Don't worry about risk. Just go hard in life. Yeah.
Go hard or go home.
Yeah.
Right.
Red light does not mean stop. Okay.
No, see, red's my favourite colour, so it never means stop to me. It's creativity and life and excitement.
That's right. You don't need helmets on a bike. Forget about seatbelts.
No, that's
josh.
different. All right, what's your quote?
So I have a quote from author Patrick Rothfuss, and from a book titled The Name of the Wind. Quote is, "It's like everyone tells a story about themselves inside their own head. Always. All the time. That story makes you what you are. We build ourselves out of that story."
Yeah, I like that.
Something different, but yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes your story and your reality don't really match, but yeah.
And isn't that such a... that's so true, but it is on a fundamental state. Sometimes we build a story in our heads, and sometimes it's a story of what's happened, but it's also a story of the future.
Yeah.
And when life does not allow us to let that story happen as close as possible, that's where a lot of frustrations can come, I think, because we know what we want out of life. Not all of us know what we want out of life, but we may know what we'd like to achieve in the next month, let's say, and how that plays against who we like to feel that we are as a person and as a soul, as an individual. And then sometimes these sledgehammers of opportunity or strange opportunities come ploughing through with life and force you to take those zigzag turns, and sometimes it doesn't correspond with the story in the head, and so it can get a bit frustrating. But yes, it can also be beautiful too when something turns out right.
Indeed. And it can be useful to make those stories in your head a reality, because the more you think it's going to happen, the more it will. You start to see the coincidences and the alignment, and your brain works.
Yeah, I wouldn't say you manifest things, but...
it's your reticular endothelial system starts to pick up the familiar things that you're talking about. And universe, whatever you like to say, there's a bit of science, a bit of woo-woo in it, but together it's out there.
Yeah, a little bit of glue, a little bit of glitter, and it all comes together sparkly.
All right, I'm going to give you my second quote, which is from Oprah Winfrey, and this is one of my favourites. And Oprah, in case you don't know, is, of course, the American talk show host, but she's also a television producer. She's been an actress, an author, and she's very much a philanthropist.
And also, just quickly butt in and just embarrass myself by saying, I didn't watch much of Oprah, but it must have been years and years before I realised her company name was her name backwards. But there you go. That is what an idiot I can be.
There you go. Very good. She said, the biggest adventure you can ever take is to live the life of your dreams.
Touche. Yes.
Touche.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think Tanya's jumped in, and I hope that you and I are doing that as well, and that our readers consider doing that.
Well, I just looked under my chair, but I don't have keys to a new car.
Is that the life of your dreams, though, Darren? Really? Wouldn't it have something more to do with Gallagher in your spare room?
Oh, top score. Yeah. That's a fantasy, not a dream.
Okay.
To get
All
to
right,
the million.
what's your second quote?
Okay, so my second quote is from author Chuck Palahniuk from a book called Choke. And the quote reads as follows. We can spend our lives letting the world tell us who we are, sane or insane, saints or sex addicts, heroes or victims, letting history tell us how good or bad we are, letting our past decide our future. Or we can decide for ourselves, and maybe it's our job to invent something better.
Nice. I was trying to let that absorb the second part. That's quite a long one.
It is a little bit, yeah. We can spend our lives letting the world tell us who we are. I like that. I mean, we all have our place in society, and by having a place in society, we have to, somewhat identify, with certain attributes that we share with everybody. But as far as, our place in society versus who we are, I think that's two different things.
Yeah.
So, and when we say, I think the quote, to me, I want to read it when we can spend our lives letting the world tell us who we are. That's more a case of do we fall victim to marketing as well? Do we seek things that we think we want, but secretly we've been told we want? And of course, growing up, I'm guilty of it, whether in the metal days or surfy days, you search for that identity and try and find out who I am. And, definitely shaped by marketing back then, probably a little bit still to this day, you just can't help it. But as far as moving into the future, it's a case of deciding for ourselves. And I like that. So, it's there's hope in the future because eventually we can get to a point where we can tell ourselves who we are, hopefully, or find out from ourselves who we are.
Stop letting other people tell us, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So,
I might have to think on that one a bit more.
I just don't believe it when the world tells me I'm the best guitar player ever. I just say, no, stop it.
Would that be air guitar, Darren?
Yeah, or a pre-recorded guitar, yeah.
There you go. So kind of at the end of the
We are
episode, which is a
indeed.
little bit sad because we could talk about many things more often. Now, tell us a little bit before we go on to the winding up things about who we've got next week, because that's a fantastic author, and I'm very excited to hear what you said to her or what she said to you.
Well, see, once again, I fell into the lucky bucket of glitter and
You sure did.
sprinkled my microphone and computer. No, I had a wonderful interview with author Kate Foster, and such a cool conversation, such a cool adventure in learning all about the motivation for her very new book, The Bravest Word.
Yes.
So if you are a lover of, well, I'm not going to say books that might bring you a little bit of tear of happiness and joy, and but if you are also a lover of animals and especially doggies, and of the challenges of growing up, and you put it all together with such a wonderful, kind heart and soul that has penned all this beautiful book, The Bravest Word, then definitely tune in for the next episode with Kate Foster, because again, I got the luckies again. Bing, 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 free spins all the way when it comes to interviews for me.
Very good. All right. Now, if you enjoyed the episode, you can hear all of our episodes. You can either go to the website and look under the podcast page, or you can go to any good podcasting platform. We're on iTunes and Spotify and Google and all of those different ones. And you can find us on social media. On Twitter, we are at Australian Books. On Facebook and Instagram, we are at Australian Book Lovers. And we're also on LinkedIn and YouTube. The links to the episodes are there. for readers. If you're interested in joining our email list and getting involved in our giveaways, and I did just post off Maribel Steele's book to one lucky winner, who it was her second win. So she was pretty excited.
Wow.
And I'm waiting for the copies of Kate's The Bravest Word to come in, and I will be sending those off to our winners as well. So if you want to, you can jump onto the AustralianBookLovers.com/booklovers and join up to our newsletter subscribers, because the giveaways are only for our subscribers. And for authors, if you are an Australian or Indigenous author and you'd like to list your book with us for free, and then, of course, that makes you eligible to be interviewed by the fabulous interviewers, Darren or myself, and share your work on our podcast, then you need to jump on AustralianBookLovers.com/for-authors and fill out the form and send us your book. It doesn't cost anything. We're happy to share, and we're really here at the moment supporting Aussie authors and Aussie readers. All right, how are we going to finish this? Do we need a kind of a whip cracking because of the cattle station?
I was thinking about that, but you know what? I think maybe we can do it now. And apologies, Tanya, if I butcher this, but I was thinking maybe as though we're both on a two-way.
Ah.
Yes.
As if we were on the School of the Air, which Tanya talked about. Yeah.
Absolutely. So.
Well, what's your call sign going to be?
My call sign, I think, is going to be DK, Kaza. I reckon Kaza.
Kaza? You're not going to be, what's D? I was going to be Victor Echo. What's S?
Oh, Sierra. I could be Delta Kilo, but no. I'd be DK or Kaza if I had a handle. Or Cyber Phoenix, which is technically my online handle. But for an Outback two-way radio. Breaker, Victor Echo Sierra. This is Kaza. Have you got your handle on?
Copy that, Deza. Yep, handle is ready.
Roger. What is the lesson for today?
Lesson is take care for now, and remember to
read more Aussie
books.
Over and over now. Victor Echo
Stand by.
Sorry, Tanya, if that made you cringe in your seat. But everybody, thank you so much for joining us for episode 54. And look forward to everybody joining episode 55. Until then,
don't forget to hang about for a book review.
Oh, yes, of course. Book reviews coming too. Take care, everyone.
Bye for now. Author P.A. Mason has begun a new series called Trouble Down Under. The first volume, which is 0.5, is called A Flytrap Fiasco and is a delightful start to a witchy cosy mystery series. Kat is a great first-time sleuth and ably assisted by the very loyal Pete and the cranky Gus. Twists and red herrings make this a fun, short read. Trouble Down Under number 1 is An Unforeseen Demise. It's a gorgeous, witchy, cosy mystery as Kat arrives in Australia from America. The author has perfectly blended the Aussie environment, customs and lingo with respect for our traditional custodians, magic and supernatural elements. And there's more of the magical community to share this sleuthing. This is a fun frolic, a great read. The next book in the series is The Kangaroo Case. More witchy mystery. The series just gets better and better. Kat is settling down in Myrtle Glen, but she can't keep her witchy fingers out of the latest mystery, and her helpful neighbours are improving her knowledge of Aussie slang and customs. So it's a great education for readers as well. Lots of fun, slick prose and likeable characters keep the pages turning as the plot twists. A great short read.
Let's meet again, where magic happens.
Australian Book Lovers acknowledges First Nations peoples and recognises their continuous connection to country, community and to culture. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and honour the sharing of traditional stories passed down through generations. We're committed to a safe and inclusive welcome for authors and readers of all cultures and backgrounds, including people of LGBTQIA+ communities and their families.